Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's great to be back in Bristol, back in the Watershed, with an even bigger proposition than when we were here last time. So I'm Andrew Chitty. I'm the AHRC's Creative Economy Champion, a title that some people in the front row seem to find very amusing. Thank you, Professor Stein. I'm just going to give you a sense of how the day's going to run. So we're going to start off with two keynotes. Obviously, key idea here is what is a creative cluster, and one of the great things about being in Bristol and having a community drawn together from the southwest and from Wales is that needs less explanation than it does in other places. So Dick Penney from the Watershed is going to give us some reflections on what binds together the Bristol cluster, and Ian Hargreaves and Sara are going to talk about what's making a cluster in Cardiff. We'll then have a break and we'll do the briefing on what the actual programme is, and I'll be doing that with colleagues from the AHRC, and then we'll top out the morning with a panel looking at some of the challenges of bringing industry, policymakers and the research community together in a cluster, which will be chaired by Anthony Lilly. But we're going to kick off this morning with Professor Andrew Thompson. He's the Chief Executive of the AHRC and who has been the driving force in what is essentially the first money from the industrial strategy for the creative industries. Andrew.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Not very often in life I'm described as the driving force. I'll take it while it's there. I've got a few things I want to say, and my team back at AHRC will know that however much they hand me PowerPoint slides or scripts, I tend not to stick to them. And the thing I think I most want to say to you all this morning, apart from a very big welcome and thank you for coming, and it's good to see the room so full, is that it's very, very clear in my mind that the programme of creative clusters that we're going to talk about today will be one of the two biggest things that happen to the Arts and Humanities Research Council over the next decade. So this is an absolutely formative moment, I think, in terms of persuading government of the not just the value, but actually the necessity of investing properly in research and development for our cultural and creative industries. And I think we're shifting the needle. I think this investment represents quite a significant shift, but it's not shifted quite as far as I would like just yet. Yeah? And so I think the programme is intrinsically important in its own right, but it has much wider ramifications beyond. So I'm just going to, before introducing our distinguished keynote speakers, give you my perspective on what this Creative Cluster Programme is all about. It's an 80 million investment, 40 million directly from government through the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, our sponsor department, and 40 million leveraged from the HEI sector, and we hope also the creative industries as well. And what this will deliver will be 8 new research and development partnerships, and it will bring together, I think for the first time, the UK's renowned creative industries with not just arts and humanities-led research, but research from other disciplines as well in our world-leading university sector. So that's a big aim that we've set ourselves. It's going to take place over 6 years, and these creative research and development partnerships will need to focus on specific industry-led challenges within established city region clusters of creative activity. Now, one way of saying that again in sort of plain prose is that, in my view, what a good bid would look like, and it's worth saying to you all here, is that I probably have the least influence in the room on the final decision-making process here. Chief executives see the outcomes at the end, but are not involved, and rightly not involved in either the peer review or the panel selection. But if I were allowed to be involved in that process and reading a bid, I think what I would want to feel is that the challenges that are articulated, the problems that are specified, had crystallized themselves through conversations between our universities and cultural and creative industries in their geographical region. That the real feel or flavour of a bid was that this had been co-authored and co-produced, was deeply collaborative, and right from the get-go, that academia and the research base was in really close, fruitful, productive dialogue with the cultural and creative industries. A bid that had that feel and flavour to it would seem to me right from the get-go as though it was travelling in the right direction and it had got the right sort of purpose and intent. There's also going to be a policy and evidence centre that we're very excited about that will help us to produce some independent analysis on the creative industries for sector and policy makers, to identify where the research gaps are, to coordinate the evidence that's emerging across the clusters themselves, and to link into government departments, particularly DCMS, but also some of our leading think tanks in the creative and cultural industries as well. That is something, the Policy and Evidence Centre, which I know that many people in the cultural and creative industries and in government have been calling for some time. We're very excited that this programme will give us an opportunity to develop that. Just rewinding a bit, the reason that we are here is because I guess the major piece of the government's domestic manifesto now is its industrial strategy. Put your hands up here if any of you have actually sort of read the white paper on the industrial strategy. Quite a few. It is worth, I think, if you're thinking of writing one of these bids, of going away and reading that white paper. I can't promise you a riveting read, but it is an informative read. And I think it will take you inside what government's hopes are for something that grew out of the white paper, which is an industrial strategy challenge fund. So almost £5 billion of genuinely new money has come into the system for research and innovation over the next 5 years as a result of the autumn statement several months ago. And much, if not all of that money, will be aligned to delivering the government's industrial strategy. So the investment that we've secured in this Creative Industries Clusters programme is through the Industry Strategy Challenge Fund. And I think actually what's quite interesting is that this was the first wave of that Industry Strategy Challenge Fund. And for the creative and cultural industries to be in there right from the get-go, right from the start, alongside healthcare and sort of big pharmaceutical industry, driverless cars and sort of batteries, satellites, is I think the first time that has ever been true in my experience of being involved with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, not just as its chief executive, but having sat on the council, our governing body, for several years before. So this really is quite a breakthrough moment for us. Any of you read, hands again, the Bazalgette Review? More, slightly more than for the industrial strategy. Well, it was also quite a special moment, I think, for a number of us, including Anthony, Lily and I, when the week before last, when Peter Bazalgette launched his review at RIBA in London with Greg Clark and Karen Bradley, the Secretaries of State from our department and DCMS present, that he gave such a full and generous acknowledgement to the Arts and Humanities Research Council and to this programme. And if you will, I'll just quote him. He said that these research and development initiatives will be awarded through a rigorous process led by the AHRC and will act as focal points for the work to grow and strengthen the creative economy wherever it's located. I strongly endorse this pioneering approach. So I think there is a palpable sense that in the huge emphasis on clustering that's in the report that Peter wrote, that this is the, if you like, that really the first significant opening salvo or pilot phase of thinking about what clustering might look like in a bigger sector deal. So there's a lot of attention upon us and therefore quite a lot of expectation of us at the same time. Another quote from Peter or Baz is, "We believe the clusters must also foster a new kind of research for and with the creative industries and not just about them." So that does go back to what I was just saying about reciprocal, meaningful, deeply rooted partnerships and genuine collaboration. This is the right approach would not be, I think, for a group of academics to sit in a room writing a bid and then sort of hawk it around their creative industry partners. The conversation about what a good bid looks like needs to start right from the beginning. Let me just say something about, in a way that is intended to be illustrative and not prescriptive, what the key components of a successful bid might look like. So what are the bases that you might want to be thinking about touching? It's really important, I think, that the clusters we invest in will stimulate economic growth through building the partnerships that I've been talking about and the new infrastructure that we need that allows closer collaboration between our universities and our creative businesses. So industry researcher partnerships to drive growth and drive skills development in our localities and in our regions are absolutely critical here. What might that look like? Well, not so long ago, I was a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for research at the University of Leeds, one of our biggest civic universities in the country. I'm responsible for research, innovation and commercialisation across the length and breadth of the university. It was an interesting time for Leeds because Leeds then had a strategic partnership with Opera North, which was very much backed by the top of the university and the Vice-Chancellor's executive group. What we didn't have at Leeds at that time is a university-owned, university-level strategy for the cultural and creative industries. We had one for biotech, we had one for energy, we had one for advanced manufacturing. Why didn't we have one for the creative industries? Now, I know that's changing, and it's changing in institutions that are represented in this room, and as a result of the efforts and energy of people who are sitting in this room at the moment. But what would, a really good outcome in sort of 5 or 6 years' time look like for me as Chief Executive of the AHRC? It would be to, and this happens when I do institutional visits, I usually end up in the office of the Vice-Chancellor there, is for them to talk to me about the strategy that they've got for their cultural and creative industries and how this cluster programme is going to play a part in delivering that. You all know, and I don't, so I don't need to tell you, that the cultural and creative industries, I suppose like any sector of the economy, have their specificities, have their distinctiveness. Now, it's true that across the length and breadth of our economy, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, I think, are underrepresented in and their needs in political discourse. But in this sector of the economy, so-called SMEs are particularly important. And working with those sorts of companies isn't always going to be the same as working with larger corporates. And that's not to say that the larger corporates, media corporations, internet platforms aren't relevant to the clusters programme and shouldn't be a part of it. But SMEs have to be a part of it as well. Now, our knowledge exchange hubs that I'll come back to in a few minutes, I think really did begin to help us to think through much more seriously, systematically, strategically what partnering with SMEs look like and how we began to do that. But this is the next significant phase on that journey. Let me come to skills. We live in a world where there is a dangerous incipient tendency to revert back to a language of STEM only, science, technology, engineering, medicine. Whereas I thought a few years ago we'd move beyond that to a language of STEAM, where the arts, the culture and humanities was absolutely recognised as being integral to the research enterprise. And I think STEAM, the fusion of skills, is absolutely critical to what we're trying to do here. So it isn't just about the arts and humanities, it's about the arts, it's about creativity, it's about design, but it's also about the digital, it's also about computing, it's about coding, it's about immersive technologies, it's about joining those things up and not seeing them separately, the fusion of skills. So there's a big responsibility, I think, on us in the room and those of you who will lead these clusters to really help us think through what at university level, potentially also I think at sort of secondary level, what we need to do to ensure that in 10 years' time, this country isn't sitting here regretting that it didn't take that skills fusion seriously when it had an opportunity to do so. How do you do all of that? What are the consequential bits of plumbing or nuts and bolts or interventions that are going to help deliver it? Well, that's for you in the room, not me to provide answers to. But I think it's taking really seriously mobility, actually, between sectors. So it's not just academics potentially going out into cultural and creative industries. It's those of you who work in cultural and creative industries finding ways for shorter or longer periods to come into academia. How do we get those that mobility upon which I think strong partnerships and the trust and confidence and respect that strong partnerships rely on can be built. IP and copyright. It's a very fast-moving world, as you will all know, in the cultural and creative industries. The AHRC made a significant investment, I'm very glad we did, in Glasgow a number of years ago to look specifically at IP and copyright for the cultural and creative industries. But there's much, much more that now needs to be done. Some of that will be done in the Policy and Evidence Centre, the research dimensions of it. But when we move into actual practice and business and what happens on the ground, it's an agenda that the clusters need to take seriously as well. I'm a historian by trade, so looking at the past to predict the future is always a dangerous enterprise. But I'd be amazed if in 10 years' time, if we all got back together, we wouldn't want to have a conversation about how the power and governance around algorithms has changed our society. But what's going on with the internet majors and platforms having huge effects on IP and copyright and the digital revolution sort of more broadly. I've probably just about, said enough before I move on to introduce our distinguished speakers. I think there's one thing that I would want to say in closing, is that successful bids do need to have a hard edge to them, an economic hard edge. They need to explain what research expertise is being mobilised, but which particular sectors or subsectors of the cultural and creative industries are you partnering with? Which firms within those sectors or subsectors? What are they contributing to your city and region? What is having a cluster going to do to help them to do things better and differently? And what specific economic outcomes will look from all of that? But I think I wouldn't be doing my job today if I didn't borrow the words of Greg Clark to say that cultural revival and economic revival in our major towns and cities absolutely go hand in hand and are mutually dependent. So I think this programme needs to have an economic hard edge to it, but it also needs to recognise the way in which to change places via arts, that we change places is often via our arts and our culture and our creativity. And that it's in the arts and culture and creative sector, particularly only for this exercise, the creative and digital and IT sector, that we have the power to transform our society as well as our economy. We sometimes talk, I think, as if the society is derivative of our economy, when often the relationship is much the other way round. I've got one thing to say before I come on and introduce our speakers. It's unusual for me to have the platform and not do some thank yous. But I actually have just one thank you that I want to do today, which is that there's somebody in the room who was absolutely at my right hand when we fought for this £40 million investment through the Industry Strategy Challenge Fund. Someone who led the knowledge exchange hub here in Bristol, in the southwest, led it with great skill and energy and insight. And although the Clusters programme is absolutely not the same as the knowledge exchange programme, that was more of a capability and capacity building exercise. That programme did in many ways pave the way for what we're doing with the clusters now, and certainly helped us to make a much more effective case into government than we would otherwise have been able to make. I can't see, and I know he's probably going to shrink away because he won't want the limelight, where John Dovey is. He's over there. But John, I will be eternally grateful for the help and support that you provided, but also equally respectful of everything that you've achieved here. So thank you very much. Okay, on to our three keynote speakers. Two of you who I already know very well. Sara, I've met for the first time today. Dick Penney, you will all know, is Managing Director of Watershed and has been since 1998. He was a founder member of Connecting Bristol, past chair of the Bristol Old Vic Theatre Trust and the Bristol Partnership LSP. In 2010, he received honorary degrees, very deservingly, from the University of Bristol and West England. And in 2011, he received his MBE. I think all I'm going to say is that Watershed exemplifies the spirit, the true spirit of the programme that we are trying to create. And what you have done here is extraordinary. And I think without Watershed, and I think John would probably agree with me here, the Knowledge Exchange Hub would never have become the thing that it was able to be. And that's an extraordinary achievement. And so we, partly build with the Clusters programme on the very firm foundations that you've laid for us. And thank you very much for that. Sarah Pepper has a really, really exciting new role as Director of the Creative Economy in Cardiff. I think you took up the post not too long ago, in the summer of sort of 2014. Huge experience in both the creative and higher education sectors. I think it's quite interesting how, we often draw sort of those divides or boundaries, but there's a huge amount of mobility across now, and people who've worked across our universities and creative industries. But you've had that experience locally, nationally and internationally, held a wide variety of posts from producer to project manager for organisations such as the South Bank Centre, the BBC, the Wales Millennium Centre, Hull University School of Arts and New Media, and the Sydney Olympic Games. So thank you for sparing the time to be with us, and you're very welcome. And then Ian Hargreaves, we've known each other for quite a while now, and Ian, Chair of Digital Economy, Cardiff University. I think that post was created back in the autumn of 2010, and significantly, I think it's based jointly in the Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, and the Cardiff Business School as well. Many of you will know Ian as a very distinguished journalist and a long career in professional journalism, including as editor of The New Statesman, editor of The Independent, deputy editor of the FT, and director of BBC News and Current Affairs. So thank you, not one, but three speakers today. We're very fortunate to have all three of you. And I think it's now time for me to hand over to you, Dick, and welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for that really rather humbling introduction. Welcome all to Bristol. And I say to Bristol rather than to Watershed, because I think the key thing that we've done as an organisation is be conscious of our context, active in our context, be part of something. And taking some of Andrew's words, I'm going to start by taking my shirt off. It's not something I normally do, this is not on a slide, but I don't want to be saying it, I just want it to be present. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I just want the slogan to be present. I don't think I'll be launching a new line in T-shirts, but I'll go back on this one, shall I? So, connected futures. I mean, for me, we're social beings. We're always connected. But I think as we increasingly deal with, respond to, engage with, drive the disruption that has happened through digital innovation, we are becoming a different society. We have different expectations. We all think and behave differently. I mean, when I was a kid, the idea of this, there was a phone box. You had to put money in the phone box. And if you weren't at the right place at the right time, you didn't know where anyone was. It's a different world. But that offers opportunities. And one of the things it's doing, it means that our sector is creating jobs. A lot of jobs. And really quickly. And lots of very different jobs. And all of the research says that these are jobs which are highly resistant to automation. So that means they are jobs for the future. And DCMS, for a number of years, has been proudly trumpeting big numbers. Very big numbers. 17% of exports. I mean, given the political mess that we're in, export is going to be really, really crucial. So, we are talking about a really vital part of our economy. And it is a surprise to me, but it is very exciting that, as Andrew said, this is really the first time it feels that government has begun to engage with the reality of what is the creative industries. It's not just big numbers. Actually, there is an industry here. And if you look at the sub-headline there, these are all DCMS stats. Creative industries, as we will all have heard many times, 90 billion. But the cultural sector, 27 billion. So, cultural is the same as telecoms. Now, we at Watershed sit somewhere, art, culture, commerce. We're not too bothered. If it's interesting and creative, we'll get engaged. But for me, the really interesting stats are buried in some very complex tables, which I was going to throw up a slide. And then Claire, our creative director, said, Dick, no one can read that. It's impossible. So I'll give you a couple of headlines. 89% of the creative industries is composed of enterprises which are 4 people or less. So, as Andrew said, SME and micro. So it's growing faster than the rest of the economy. Yet between 2007 and 2014, which are the latest stats, the average size of a company in the creative industries went down by 15%. So we're growing, but company size went down. 3.3 FTEs was the average in 2014. So that's a bit of a conundrum for an industrial strategy. Companies are getting smaller, but the economy is growing. So it's not about huge industrial complexes. The growth industries of our century, of the 21st century, depend on people infrastructure, not factory infrastructure. Growth is very much about flexible, agile companies which are just proliferating, and they are deploying adaptive, shape-shifting strategies to deliver on projects which constantly demand new solutions. One of the big brand sectors in this town, not just natural history, factual. It's a major centre of factual production. Blue Planet, the whole Earth series major international profile. Blue Planet 1 premiered on the 12th of September 2001. 17 years ago. 16 years ago, I can't add. It's sold to over 50 territories. It span out DVDs, books, feature film, live concert tour. Blue Planet 2, which is just about to launch, will see far wider spin-outs, far wider distribution, because the platforms, the markets are so much more diverse. Huge opportunity. So how do we make sense of this growing complexity? Growth that we can't see because it's new companies. GVA that we can't touch in concrete or steel. Innovations that arrive as if from the ether. So be it network or ecosystem, how do they work? What are they? What makes them innovative and productive? So there's been a growing body of research. Nesta have been very much in the van. Lots of university researchers have contributed. There's become a real sense of place matters, a real sense that through place comes cluster. And so this concept of cluster is emerging from network or ecosystem. And so I did a quick search. You know, you're asked to do a talk. What is a cluster? And this is what came up on good old Google. So lots and lots of interesting words there about what's a cluster. Array, band, knot, gathering, party. I like that one. But not many antonyms. In fact, we've got two. Individual and one. This is the conundrum that you know, we are all individuals, so why do we cluster together? And I think the key thing is we're individuals, we're not clones, that we cluster together because we are both different and common, that we learn from and support each other, that it's about co-opetition or some other mangled word. And it's not just collaboration between content producers, it's artists, it's designers, it's coders, it's researchers, it's 3D modelers, it's academics, it's writers. You know, the list, you know, we could stay here all day. It's a system. It's a connected system. Is it creative? Is it tech? I don't know, but it's full of ambition and imagination. And with such a complexity of disciplines and expertise, the spaces where people can come together, formally, informally, spaces like this, there are many around the country, are becoming much, much more important. And I think that in creating these spaces, they're physical as well as intellectual. Cultural infrastructure plays a really vital part. It's often through culture that we can collectively engage in fresh ideas. And culture is, in and of itself, diverse, inclusive, curious and collaborative, open and engaged. And within the convening space, the meeting space, the role of the connector, the enabler, the creative producer is absolutely vital to activating the connections that come about through clustering. It's not a static thing, it's completely dynamic. And this is our Pervasive Media Studio. This is the space that is at the other end of our building. Most of the activity happens in the public spaces. Most of the important stuff happens in the cafe and the bar. But when you need to get down to business, this is the space that we've created to enable people to come together. It's a formal collaboration with UWE and UOB. It's a formal collaboration across disciplines. It's absolutely one of these places. And I mean, we're already under capacity, so we're just in the process of creating a VR immersive lab, which will launch next month. Again, a partnership with both the Bristol universities, but also Bath Spa University have come on board, and the BBC, and there'll be a lot more in a minute. So for me, it's not about Watershed, it's about Bristol. It's absolutely about place. Lonely Planet, lots of other people said lots of nice things about Bristol. I believe them. So for me, it's about finding new ways of supporting the collective. We need new metrics which see everybody in the harbour float. We need to move from the I of the individual and the institution to the we of the network and the cluster in the way we think, the way we fund, the way we evaluate. The challenge is how do we invest in the common goal for the benefit of the cluster as a whole, not for the individual or the lead institution. We have to believe if the cluster grows, we all individually benefit. So new industrial thinking is a huge challenge. Government have made a huge step. Andrew has been instrumental in convincing them of that. It's a fantastic injection that we're being given here of energy and resource into R&D and innovation in our sector. We need to take that challenge and take it forward and give Andrew the ammunition to leverage even more support and resource for the creative sector, which is going to carry this country into the next few decades. Thank you very much.
If I put that screen down, is it going to do something horrible? Yeah, I can't do that, can I? I'll do that. Okay, right. So, well, so advance warning of the joke. This is the analogue burden of the job of being a digital professor. But it doesn't. It looks so brief on the screens, doesn't it? I am here just to do a warm up for Sarah Pepper. I spend most of my time introducing or thanking Sarah. Sarah said, before Sarah talks about Creative Cardiff and the work that is now very interestingly and energetically going on there, that she thought that an audience like this would need just to be reminded about how we got there. So I'm historian for 5 minutes. I've got to do 15 seconds per annum to cover the last 20 years. So how did all of this happen from my perspective on it? Well, having done various jobs in journalism, as Andrew kindly mentioned, I took a job at Cardiff University's journalism school, founded by the man on the left, Tom Hopkinson, who was editor of the thing on the right, Picture Post, or had been that. And when I fetched up there at the back end of 1998, 1999, the machine in the middle was what the trainee journalists were all operating. Those machines, sometime later, found their way to Cardiff prison. And eventually, the digital show got on the road. I continued working in journalism in this period as well, but then I took one or two other jobs. I went to try to help the Foreign Office become digital. And one of the consequences of the Foreign Office being digital is that my boss, the Foreign Secretary of that period, David Miliband, will never be able to get that picture off the internet. I then, whilst I was working at the Foreign Office, because by then I was kind of half living in Cardiff, having worked there, I was asked by the coalition government, which existed at the time between Plaid Cymru and Labour, if I would do a review of creative industries in Wales. So I did that. Its Welsh name is much more attractive, isn't it? Calon Cymru Digidol. So I did that and made all sorts of important recommendations about a strategic hub for the creative industries. And creative industries have done well in Wales, not only in South Wales, but especially in South Wales. David Miliband had to give me half a day off a week to go and do this. So in between dealing with the invasion of Georgia and other matters, this review was produced. The next thing that happened was, what happened next? Oh yeah, what happened next was that David Miliband and his party lost the election, and therefore I knew that although I was in government, it was a civil service job, I decided that I would leave when the election took place anyway. So I was on my way out, and I went to talk to my colleagues at Cardiff University. And my former boss, Professor Justin Lewis, who is very much involved in the work that we are now doing, said to me, well, why don't you come back to the university in a new job? So I said, well, what would that new job be? And he said, well, why don't you make one up, and then we'll see whether people think it's a good idea. So I said, well, I'd like to be a professor of the internet. And that seemed, a bit too much of a bad joke. So we called it Professor of Digital Economy. Pretty soon there were quite a lot of professors of digital economy, but there are not many now. It's one of those things that caught on a bit, but never really caught on. So anyway, that's how I became Professor of Digital Economy. But no sooner had I become Professor of Digital Economy than somebody rang up and said, the new government, this was then the Cameron-Clegg government, I think there's a thing about me and coalition governments. Somebody rang up from that government and said, would I review intellectual property law in the United Kingdom? So I said yes and produced that report. And that was the next thing that happened. And that led to the next thing that happened, which was this. Because having got involved in a great brouhaha about copyright, as Andrew said, it goes on and requires careful thought and occasionally some courage. But the Manifesto for the Creative Economy has in it, on page 61, 7 rules for creative clusters. Now, I have seen Dick Penney sitting in the coffee bar at the Watershed, marking up that page and what's more, I didn't see him doing it this morning. I saw him doing it all those years ago when this came out. What year did it come out? 2013, this came out. There we are. You'll recognise, if you can read them, the other authors who include, who are Hassan Bakshi and Juan Matias Garcia. It's fantastic to me to see, particularly, Hassan, everybody knows about Hassan, but Juan has emerged as a leading data scientist in the creative economy, and I hugely enjoyed doing that with those two. What else did we do? The slides tell us. Oh yes, we did that. That was Connected Communities, and that was John Dovey and I briefly became the world's least celebrated academic duo, because not only a few people in this room anyway, know that he and I was a member of his team when it came to React. I represented Cardiff University on the React programme. But we had actually met at a very, very furtive event in the Midlands, which was one of those sort of dating meetings that probably AHRC and ESRC ran together. And we devised with other colleagues a partnership which eventually led to this book, which was all about citizenship and social media. Part of the Connected Communities programme. And then, of course, React did all its work. Dick has already referred to that. React, to me, was hugely, hugely important. It was hugely important in that, having gone into a university in a journalism school which existed to in significant part to meet the skills needs of an industry. Quite an unusual role in a way for a Russell Group type university to be playing. But the interconnectedness in journalism between scholarship and the news industry was very, very close. And in React, I found myself, and the people who were working with me, Tim Cole from University of Bristol, now running the Brigstow Institute, we found ourselves having to ask a different set of questions of our colleagues to go on a journey, really, and in an R&D innovation type direction. And that, I didn't realize it when it began, but I came to realize it, also put us on a course for kind of having quite a lot to say about the university's overall innovation and engagement strategy. So React was a very, very big event in this 20-year period that I am. There's Justin Lewis, and me. When we got to the end of these big funded projects, React and the Connected Communities work, Justin, head of school he was at the time, who's since stepped down from that and is now Professor of Communications, he said to me, "What do you really want to do now? You've done this is what you've done, what am I going to do next?" And the only thing that I could think of that I really, really wanted to do was to apply the thinking which had gathered in my head as a result of having a lot of cups of coffee with Dick Penney and sitting in meetings with John and Tim and colleagues from Bath and Exeter as well. And I wanted something to happen in the place that I was living and based, so Cardiff. I could see that we had the opportunity of a pretty good set of circumstances growing in the creative industries, but I wanted to try to find a way for that university at that time to grow something that would really make a difference to the creative economy of the place that the university is in. And that's when I met Sara, who applied for the job of creating it. So she can take all the credit for what happened next. And that's what, you're going to talk about it.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Ian. I have lots to thank you for. It's not that you always stand and thank me. So, this was Ian and Justin's vision, and I'm delighted to say 3 years later, I'm going to tell you what we've achieved in that time. So I'm a theatre producer and programmer by trade. I have some 15, 20 years of experience working in small, medium and large-scale venues and events, from boutique festivals to the global event that's the Sydney Olympic Games. And don't I look chuffed to be there? So 17 years ago, I can't believe it. I've regularly worked between the boundaries of the subsidised and very commercial end of production in the creative industries, and I well understand that tricky relationship, but also the potential synergies between both. I did my first degree in Cardiff, that's my Cardiff connection, and I was back living there and working some sort of 15 years later, often finding myself having conversations with people along the lines of where Cardiff was at from its sort of creative industries perspective, what was working, what wasn't, the lack of connectivity, the siloed sector working, the gaps, the missed opportunities. And then this job was advertised, Director of Creative Economy. It was my dream job. That's actually reported in the article they published in Arts Professional when I got it, and I still believe that today. A chance to connect all the different parts of the city at all levels and across visible and invisible barriers, segments, to further the creative economy in the place that I was living. And I'd come to care very much for the city. And a chance also to find out whether Cardiff University's £200 million innovation system project, with its compound semiconductors and brain imaging centre, had the appetite for a creative dimension to its work. We're still to see. and wow, they gave me the job. So that's about me, but what about Cardiff at this point? It wasn't just the job that interested me, much in the same way that Ian described. It was the place, the city. Cardiff is a city with a population of 340,000. It has a history of heavy industry, which is well known and understood, the coal and steel and so on. But the decline of those industries has made way more recently for a city developing in, amongst other things, tourism, sport, financial services, life sciences, and, hey, the creative industries. And as Ian said, I concur, there have been really many high points around TV, film, music, and performing arts in the city. It is now, data suggests, after London, the fastest growing city in the UK and one of the fastest growing capitals in Europe. The development of the city to a city region, which will swell the population from 340,000 to 1.5 million, and the success in securing a city deal is adding to this speed of growth. But despite all of the upsides and opportunities, it's easy to gloss over those and talk about growth. Like many other cities, Cardiff is facing a number of challenges, including significant poverty and deprivation, complex ethnic identities, and as yet, the unresolved question of the region's post-industrial future. It is our firm belief that the creative economy has a major part to play in this, in helping us to address these challenges and to build upon the record of growth and success in ways that I've already reported. So, on to the nuts and bolts. What did we do when we started this creative economy project? Well, the first thing that I did was to try and build a community, a cluster, if you like, within the organisation in which I was working. So in order to understand the resources around me, I gathered together an event and amazingly, the room was full to bursting of academic colleagues who were interested for some reason in the creative economy. A lot of them probably didn't know quite why, but they came along to find out more. And I'm thrilled to say that 3 years later, we have 230 academic colleagues at the university in that said research network. What we've done over the period is drill down into different research groups where people have specialist interests, into creative labour and cultural production, festivals research, immersive tech. But these are academic colleagues from all disciplines across all schools. We have dentists and medics as much as we have arts and humanities scholars. So we gathered our community, if you like, from within. The next thing we did was go about mapping the industry picture around us. We needed to gather a list of contacts from within that community. And so we embarked on a far lengthier than first imagined and quite complicated mapping research project. I'm sure I don't need to talk about why mapping this sector is difficult to this particular room. The work took over a year to complete, and we learned a huge amount whilst we were doing it. We learnt a lot about the organisations and freelancers in our city, the sectors and the clusters. And this work culminated in a symposium about a year ago to share our findings and hear from others around the UK in terms of their work in this area. The next job we did was set up what has now become one of the key strands of our work, Creative Cardiff, the Creative Cardiff Network. It's a membership network which connects, engages and amplifies the creative economy community in Cardiff. We exist online and in real time. We have a web platform which includes membership profiles of our now 1,400 members. It also communicates jobs and opportunities, long reads and features about people and what's happening in the city, and really just generally covers the whole picture across the city. We also host a programme of events to connect people with ideas, knowledge and social opportunities, which I think is really important. And we've been thrilled, absolutely thrilled with the response to the network. Week in, week out, our metrics have taken an upward trajectory. Engagement on social media is hot, with 9,000 followers on our Twitter account set up 18 months ago, and our events continuously book and sell out. Now, I believe this is testimony to our approach, which is firmly rooted in one of co-production and co-creation with our community. In the first year, we ran a campaign called 52 Things. 52 things made by, with, or for our community, our cluster. And in fact, in a week's time, we'll be celebrating our second birthday with 150 members of those of the network, with a bumper event and an enormous birthday cake. So as well as the people in our network, the members of that network I was just talking about, that cluster, We've also retained an interest throughout in the places and spaces that those people are operating in across the city. We've done a number of projects over the past 3 years to better understand and engage the co-working and workspace hubs environment in the city, and latterly the city region. This has included all manner of things from a vertical studio project with the excellent Welsh School of Architecture to a pop-up hub actually supported by colleagues at the Watershed at Wales Millennium Centre, to my personal favourite, a hub crawl for 100 people across the city on a very rainy night. They traversed the city to 3 different hubs. We've also mapped the hubs in the city region and recently launched the Co-working Collective to share best practice knowledge and sometimes a bit of therapy between hub managers. So it's important to say at this point that we're not doing this work alone. Everything we have done and achieved has been done in partnership with others, students, graduates, startups, micros, SMEs, large organisations, colleagues at other higher education institutions in the city, University of South Wales and Cardiff Metropolitan University, creative hubs, public sector bodies, industry agencies, unions, local government, and I'd like to mention particularly Cardiff City Council, who've been extraordinarily supportive of our work, and so on and so on and so on. Decision makers, influencers, the press and media. We've had an extraordinary level of support from all manner of stakeholders across the city, and I believe that this is of core importance to what we've achieved over the past 3 years. So, a final thought. So what next? I'll just explain this picture because otherwise it may seem a bit, whilst beautiful, a bit random. This is a picture taken at City of the Unexpected, the celebration of the centenary of Roald Dahl's birth that happened on the 23rd of September last year. A date I will never forget because I was in hospital having my son, the date of the largest ever cultural experience that the city saw. I was in labour, but I was getting reports as labour was going on. That's a different story. So the reason that I chose this, apart from being quite a beautiful and visionary image, is that this was very much about where the city had got to, a moment in time where an ambitious and visionary project that attracted between 200 and 300 visitors to the city for a weekend of extraordinary and unexpected happenings that was reported in New York in a similar way to the book James and the Giant Peach itself. Now, what next? What is our vision? What's our giant peach? Where are we trying to get to in the future with Creative Cardiff? Well, our next steps are already in early stage R&D. Quite simply, we are keen to widen the focus of our work to embrace the city region. The emergence of the city deal and the Cardiff capital region will help us to engage and take in more with a more widely geographic community and consequently more diverse community. And with the development of the Metro, a 20-year transportation and infrastructure project now underway, this will allow us an infrastructure environment for effective transportation to engage and physically connect with that community too. The city region is half of the population of Wales. I'll say that again because it's a very important statistic for us to consider. The city region, the Cardiff capital region that I'm talking about, from Newport up to the heads of the valleys through to Merthyr, is half of the population of Wales, 1.5 million people. This is not a geographic region or number to be sniffed at. And this requires Creative Cardiff to scale up and up our game. And this is the plan for us over the coming years. Thank you for letting us share our story and ambitions.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, Ian, Dick. I think we started off with Andrew giving you all a hint that there's a hard edge to this programme, but I think the stories of Bristol and Cardiff show how subtle it is, this business of developing and supporting and maintaining functioning clusters by keeping community at the heart of it, whether it's over a long period or whether it's self-consciously building towards a new future. So we're now going to have a coffee break, and afterwards I have the role of introducing what the actual call is, the exam question, as Andrew would put it, and you get to ask some preliminary starting difficult questions about what we actually mean. So we'll see you back in here at 11 o'clock. Thanks. Hello, welcome back. It's amazing how many of us have all in the past life at some stage worked in production in film or television or theatre, and how long it can take us to mic ourselves up. But here we go. We're ready now. So, the briefing bit. You will have, no doubt, all seen the heads-up call that we put out before the summer, and you may all have had a chance to read the full call documents that went live very late on Friday night. I hope you were all staying up for them. But what I'm going to do is just set the scene a little bit about clusters. We've heard a lot about clusters this morning. Perhaps just revisit that in the way that we see it as part of the challenge. And what you'll see as part of this is there's a whole load of stuff that we think, and then there's going to be a lot of questions you're going to ask about what we think, and we're going to go, no, what do you think? Because there's a delicate balance here between the kind of policy objectives behind the funding and the programme objectives in terms of outcomes, and then the bottom-up strategies that each of the bids that will come forward will be trying to implement, and they really have to come from the ground up. So, as we've heard from Andrew introduced us this morning, this is the context for this is the £1 billion investment in the £4 billion altogether in the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And when the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund was announced, the first investments that were made were kind of rather traditional, what you might think of as industry. So the automotive sector, and batteries, future of electric vehicles, remotely piloted robotic vehicles and dangerous environments, and North Sea exploration and that kind of thing, and lots of stuff about the medical technology, medical devices and pharmaceutical sector. So there wasn't at that stage, in that first set of announcements, much about Britain's world-class creative industries. And as I think Dick had the slide with all the fantastic numbers on it that we're familiar with, and some that perhaps we're not so familiar with. So I think one of the interesting things that we have found, and I've found particularly coming from outside the academic world into this kind of fast developing environment, is within government, the argument about the importance of the creative industries within policy is largely one. But then when you try and apply that to the idea of the importance of investing in R&D in the creative sector, that isn't one at all. For some people, that still does not compute. So whereas in manufacturing and engineering and molecular biology and healthcare, that seems it's fundamental understanding of that fundamental research and investment in fundamental research develops future value. That case within the creative sector hadn't been made, and that's really the fight that Andrew and Anthony and the AHRC have led to convince people about making an investment of this type. And then last Friday, Baz's review, Greg Clark stood up and announced this programme. Fortunately, we had been working on it a bit beforehand. It wasn't just 8 days' notice to try and organise these events, but announced this programme as a pilot of the whole interest in clustering that has come through Baz's review and underpins the sector deal. Now, nobody could disagree with that statement. It's great. There was talk within the context of Baz's review, essentially of this being a pilot for all the things in Bazalgette. So I think it's worthwhile saying that Baz's review picks up all the arguments and all the support mechanisms that are needed to develop clusters. What we're trying to do here is look at a very specific set of objectives, which is industry research partnerships that drive R&D and future value in clusters. So I think there's an important distinction there to make. So there are clusters, as we've heard from the examples, the city-based clusters, Cardiff and Bristol, we've heard how many elements and strands there are to making a successful cluster work. Yes, there are businesses, yes, there are HEIs, but there are support mechanisms, there's regional economic policy, there's access to finance, there's getting together in bars, which seems to be a large part of it once you get outside London. This investment has to dovetail and be embedded within all those other things, but the primary purpose is to deliver R&D-led growth within the creative industries. And what that will be in each cluster, what that R&D programme will be in each cluster, will be different. So I was asked the other day, in the context of one of these meetings, are you expecting there to be a games are you looking for a games cluster or a serious games cluster? Are you looking for a a digital health cluster? Are you looking for a screen? We're not looking like that at all. What is the question that you've got to answer is, what are the needs and challenges within this cluster of organisations and businesses that can be resolved through R&D? So it comes from the grassroots up. So that's important context. So I'm going to brush through, because that's my colourful slide, but it's not as good as Dick's, and it's more familiar to everybody. But as I say, the kind of things that these slides portray are accepted, I think, within policy making at a level. It's the link with R&D that we've got to make. So the other side, clustering, obviously, is the work. What are clusters? We've heard mentioned before Hassan and Juan at Nesta, and obviously this is a report they did with Creative England on the geography of creativity in the UK. There have been other reports, so other sectors are looking at clustering as well, and there is a little bit of I think, an emerging kind of language in government of clusters, which seems to me quite unhelpful just at the moment, because clusters of clusters, they're cities really. So I think we do pay attention to that stuff, and I think the mix between, say, digital technology and creative industries within any particular cluster is different. But we ended up with the Creative England report with a series of clusters identified. I think normally at this point I make reference to the fact that Birmingham doesn't appear on this. We're doing this in Birmingham tomorrow, so I must remember not to do that tomorrow. But there is various clusters that are identified. So both BAS and the CIC, and I suppose ourselves, really derive our thinking, our definition of clusters from Nesta. So there's a number of elements that I think are all common. So geographic concentration of creative businesses and workers, so that's a really important thing. Link through value chains. So there's obviously something really, really interesting about them, not just the businesses, but the mix of businesses and how they interact with each other, how they collaborate, how they can share knowledge, whether that's sharing workforce or sharing supply chains. There's then the interaction with the AHRCs. So it's interesting that how Nesta defined this can often include other institutions. So in some places those networks are very closely linked and have proved highly valuable, and the relationships are well found. In other areas, you'd be surprised how much some of the university sector and the businesses sit apart. I think, oddly, that's particularly true in London. But cultural institutions, the intermediaries, the trade associations, and particularly the government bodies, the LEPs, the metro regions that are emerging in England, they can support the cluster. So there's an architectural point there, and then there's a diversity issue. So there are different kinds of clusters, and they can be different shapes, but all of them that are successful probably have shared spaces or hubs or things like that. So I think we kind of all pick that up. Now, we've decided to, so we're working quite closely with Nesta in trying to see what the data says. So this is basically the data that comes out of the geography of creativity and will underpin the next release, which is Creative Nation, which is coming sometime before Christmas. So this is a pattern that you're very familiar with. This is the clusters of all the creative industries. So what we've asked Nesta to do, and Juan's working with us at the moment on this, and we will release this data sometime in the next week, both as data and as maps, for you to play with, hoping it might be useful in shaping bids, at least as reference points, is we've asked them to have a look at cutting that data by subsector. Because in a sense, the cluster, the overall data of all the creative industries gives a pretty obvious pattern. There's a large concentration in the southeast. We've got Central Belt and Scotland. Red is hot, blue is cold, basically, on these maps. But what happens when you look at subsectors? Because if people are going to come to us with bids that say, our cluster is characterised by world-class industries and companies in this sector with cultural institutions and our great researchers, how do we know that that's the case? How can we provide people with data to see where they are, where they're building their bids? So we're going to release this data, and this is kind of a little bit of a preview because we only got the maps through last night. So some subsectors clearly mimic the overall pattern. So film, TV, and radio, and of course photography, these are the DCMS classifications, pretty much maps onto the national pattern. You see that concentration in the southeast. You get central pattern in Scotland. Interestingly, this area, Bristol and Cardiff, you get a concentration. The cities that are highlighted are in each case the 10 with the highest proportion of employment. Architecture, however, is part of the creative industries. I think in this context, it is a world-class UK international tradable service sector. Is much more widespread. So it doesn't show that dominance in the southeast. Very interesting, if you look at there about employment in the southwest is really quite warm for architecture, as is and up into the Marches. So some quite interesting things, and you'll be able to drill down into this data. As you might expect, craft is, again, a different pattern, and craft is particularly interesting when you're thinking about clusters because of its presence, particularly in employment rather than businesses, in the periphery of the UK. So what we're trying to do is just unpick this pattern of these travel to work areas. Museums, galleries and libraries, I think, is a particularly interesting one. Not the concentration, again, in the southeast that you might expect. Very, very evenly spread as a sector. We're going to obviously drill down into what's happening now on the northwest coast of Scotland in terms of employment. There may be some large memory-based institutions that we've actually not found yet. So we've got, when we release this data, you can drill down into it yourself. So just looking, we started to just kind of cut and mess around with some of this stuff already. But music and performing arts and visual arts, so the arts sector, concentrated business count in the south, but in employment, again, very widely spread with particular kind of hotspots that apply both to Bristol and to Wales and the further southwest. And similarly, we see that kind of a different distribution in publishing. So what I'm going to say is that we're going to release this data. Please use it as you will, but do please use it, because one of the fundamental parts of putting forward a winning bid here is to prove evidence that you understand the cluster of which you're part, and that if you're in a region that might not be thought of as a hotspot for a particular thing, that you evidence why you think it is, rather than that your lead institution has a very good academic team who are interested in that area. Because that's different. A research interest is different from an applied research program embedded within a cluster, we think. So, Baz, just to leave the clusters point, Baz thought that pulled out that the price for supporting the clusters is threefold. So, stimulus to regional growth, improving productivity through either increasing the density of businesses, so that could be new businesses or businesses moving in, or scaling businesses in the sector. And the third thing he brought out was developing a tailored talent and R&D pipeline for local areas, aka clusters. So I think whilst we'd sign up to the first two as very much the overall context, the thing that the Creative Industries Clusters Programme is really aiming at is that third one. And again, and Anthony, I'm sure we'll pick this up with the panel, I'm making no apologies for keeping saying industry and keeping saying business. This is an absolutely key part. This is not normal Research Council funding. This is Industrial Strategy Fund money, which is great, but it comes with strings attached, and the strings attached are the objectives are economic growth. So, what is the programme? So, top line, growing the creative industries through driving growth through R&D. Said that a number of times. Creating a robust R&D infrastructure. So there is a thing here about building a sustainable connection between R&D and creative businesses. And we've got £51 million to do this. Core elements, as Andrew said right at the top, up to 8 creative R&D partnerships. Not necessarily 8, but up to 8 to boost R&D activity. So we're seeing these as somewhere between £4 and £6 million of direct AHRC funding into each of them. And a Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. And as Andrew explained, the objective there is to create an institution that sits as an independent observatory and guarantor of creative industries data. Because one of the observations is there's a lot of data about the creative industries. Some of it, and some of the most compelling and exciting, produced from a position of advocacy rather than independence. So what are the purposes of these R&D partnerships? Well, they're to meet the opportunities and threats of the creative industries. So you'll see in the documentation, we've outlined a number of those. New business models, IP, but particularly new business models, I would say personally, are a challenge for the creative industries. The investment pipeline, the skills shortages, both long and short term, the problem of driving exports, the issues that certainly some of the sectors have with equality and diversity. Those are the contexts that we want everybody to be putting together their propositions within. But if there is one that sits as the first amongst equals, it's product and service innovation. So this seems a particular, this is easy to understand, I think, at a policy level, that R&D leading to product and service innovation is something that you invest in, even if creative research and development is different from engineering. So product and service innovation sits at the heart of what we expect all the winning bids or successful bids to develop. Now, aims. This isn't such. I doubt this is such a controversial area in this room, but there may be people who would differ with this. The aim of this project is to enhance existing creative clusters. That's a pragmatic but fixed decision. We are not, through this programme, developing clusters. The experiment is to insert and fund an extra R&D function, and to do that and have the effect and test it, we need it to be within existing clusters. The wider BAS review will look at developing clusters, I'm sure. So what we want you to do is leverage existing assets within that. Now, so clusters do that, whether they're cultural institutions or the large companies or the AHRCs or the hubs that already exist. It's leveraging those things that are valuable. And so it's about bringing the universities, the creative industries, and the cluster enablers together in partnership. And I will say this, and let me probably get away with 3 times before you throw stones at me. The lead applicant for these bids must be an HEI, but it's important to recognise that the HEI is applying on behalf of the partnership, not on behalf of itself. So this is not about funding a university to do this. This is about funding a partnerships to deliver this, routing the money through the university. So the creative R&D programmes are to address the challenges faced by the clusters. And the emphasis is to step up the growth and impact the creative businesses in those places. Now, I say places, there's a spectrum. There are clusters that are entirely geographically based and might have a spread of industries who can come together to look at common challenges. At the other end, you might have a cluster that is entirely sectorally based, not quite so tightly defined by geography. We're open to both of those, but there is a large place-based element to this. So what we're looking for is for you to describe your cluster and evidence that you know about it. And I've covered the PEC previously, and that's the subject of a separate competition. So R&D partnerships, key features embedded within an existing creative cluster. I think I've said that probably enough times, but we'll only know when you put in the statements of intent. What we want you to do is essentially to come together as a partnership and identify the barriers, and that's the barriers that companies have that can be then attacked with R&D programs. And those R&D programs should be articulated as challenges. This isn't just because this is now the language of policy making, but it forces people to define what the challenge, what the problem is they're trying to solve, and that comes from those an intimate knowledge of those businesses and from the researchers knowing which of those problems can be attacked through R&D. It's hosted by an HEI, as I said, but it must bring together the relevant partners to address the challenges, and that isn't just research. So it's industry, obviously, but it's local and regional government, it's the sector bodies, it's the economic development bodies, which are different in different parts of the UK these days, which makes this fun, and it's also we would be very, very interested in seeing how you convene the investment community. And I know the investment community in some areas, and I think it would be interesting for Gail, who's on the panel from Creative England, to talk about that, how those things can be brought together. And then it's to collaboratively design and deliver an R&D programme. The focus here is on new activity. We all know we're asking for a lot of things here. We're asking for multidisciplinarity, we're asking for new kinds of research, but we are asking for new. We're not asking for continuation of the same. Multidisciplinarity, it's the arts and humanities. We are the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but we're doing this on behalf of UKRI. So it's also about bringing in STEM and the social sciences. And it's, you know, that again, I know from many of the collaborations that exist within this room, that is not an unusual feature, but it is in other areas. It's also going to be dynamic. So we want a clear challenge and approach at the outset, but you will need to evolve it, and we do understand that. It's really important that it can be flexible, and we'd be very interested in how you think as the competition goes further on, how you think you can implement a flexible, and I'm about to say agile approach, even if, as we all know, the agile word is used perhaps too much. So on the challenges, and I hesitate to say this again, but it's going to be really important. Challenges must be defined by the needs of the cluster. So challenges can't be thought up just by the research community on their own. I think we will spot that, and it won't be the right answer. So they have to be recognised by industry, but they have to really be articulated by industry. We'd like a due focus on R&D for new products, services and experiences. That's not to ignore those other pressures, but I think it's worth saying that that is a area which we think is particularly tractable and particularly valuable. And crucially, having identified that, having done the big job of saying this is the challenges, this is what we're going to do, you actually have to have a partnership that can then address them. Now, I know that seems obvious, but it's surprising how often that isn't the case. And they need to be distinct and measurable. How does it lead to growth within the cluster of those businesses or the cluster as a whole? What do you think you need to do to get this? What do we think you need to do to get this? Strategy and vision. What are the characteristics and strengths of this cluster? What are the details of the partnership? Who's involved and who's contributing what? That's a crucial thing. Every person in the partnership or every organisation needs to contribute something. So I think if there's a message here, coming from outside, again, this is a slightly personal view, I think there's been lots of incentives for lots and lots of research institutions to collaborate with each other in wide partnerships. Maybe this is really talking about something a lot more focused. Perhaps the incentives here are to collaborate with other partners rather than a wide array of just HEIs. Your collaborative R&D programme will evolve. So we've got expression of interest. Give us some idea if you can. Stage 1 bids, a clearer idea. Those that are shortlisted, we will work through to make those R&D programmes deliverable, achievable and distinctive. It's all about collaboration. It is about cross-disciplines, interdisciplines. I think Anthony will probably say in a moment, anti-disciplinary. The senses of bringing lots of different perspectives and skills to bear on this. But it is about creating solutions. We do think you'll need very strong and shared leadership. That's going to be really, really key. I think you're going to need really strong governance structures. And again, they'll be different because you're collaborating with partners from different domains than they would be if they were just HEI. So again, one might want to think about how creative businesses and industries and also local economic actors are represented within that governance structure so that it can align and leverage their things that are going on. I think you need to think about the leadership, the director, or so think director, don't think PI. I would think is just a way of thinking about it. So that and the background of that director as well could be coming from a number of different traditions. And again, I'll finish that slide by saying the application, it is on behalf of the partnership, of the cluster, and not an application solely by the lead HEI. And I think we have to keep saying that just to get the message across of what we're asking people to do here. So here we got key dates and milestones, engagements, events. That's where we are at the moment. Submission of the statement of intent, 27th of October. Okay, so this, we are not asking a huge amount at this stage. There are a couple of things we're asking you. Who's the lead institution? One of the reasons there is we can have more effectively communicate with the community if we've got a list of runners and riders and some contacts to do so that we can help people develop their bids. We also would like a description of the shape of the partnership. We understand that may not be complete, and similarly some indication of direction, but that doesn't have to be complete until the stage 1 bids. What we would like to do as well is there's an opportunity in the statement of intent to put out a statement of what you might be looking for as well. And the Creative Economy comms team and the AHRC comms team will push that out to other people, because if people are absent something that they need, we'll try and help you find that. So then we go on, deadline for stage 1 applications, early December. We assess, and the outcomes of that early February. And then stage 2, we roll into stage 2 with a shortlist. We do know that at that shortlisting stage, we want to have a more, kind of intimate discussion and look at some of the elements of the bids, and we'll take a kind of portfolio approach at that stage, I think. And there may be some things that we can leverage on, some extra elements that we may be able to introduce by then. And you'll know all about this by the early summer, and this time next year, these things will be up and running. Now, I know for some people in there that looks like a very, very accelerated timescale. One of the features of the industrial strategy is that it itself has a limited lifespan. So there is a great deal of pressure to get on with this from our funding sources. So hopefully that gives you the start to ask some really, really difficult questions. I'm going to ask Dylan Law to come up and join me on the stage, because I always need an AHRC minder at this point, because I never really know how things should be done. Do please ask tough questions. We did first rollout yesterday in London. We had lots of people from diverse places and things, and it never really got we never really lit a bonfire under it. And I think I'd rely on this room to ask us some more tricky things. And that does include the speakers and panellists. Do feel free. So, who'd like to kick us off? We've got roving mics, so we'll start over there. Can we bring the house lights up a tiny bit?
Thanks for running through that. I'm Paul Appleby from Bristol Media, as some of you will know. The R&D within micro businesses is a real challenge. Is part of the aim of this to change the definition of R&D from the science-based model to the Frascati model? And do you have any leverage in Bayes in order to do that?
Okay, so that's a very, very live question. So we are somewhere between sympathetic and co-conspirators with Hassan and Nesta on the efforts to not so much revise the R&D model, but look at the use of it and its application towards the creative industry. So this is something that Baz picks up in his review, and I think will follow through in the sector deal. That's a kind of really big question, trying to move government departments about how they think about creative R&D. There's probably, as I understand it, and I'm no expert, there's more flexibility in Frascati in its current definitions than is actually used in government. Yeah. So I think the tactic may well be to say, actually, creative and humanities and social science research is in there. You just don't think it is. I think that's the argument that we need to make. So that's the opportunity exists. It's just not picked up. So I think one of the elements that will change that is UKRI coming together, because this is an important place to land that argument with respect to SMEs, is with Innovate UK. So we actually have an argument about what creative R&D is, and that there aren't TRL levels to it necessarily, or if we need to work something out, something that works for them in understanding this. I think that's a big thing that we can't. It's a big endpoint. There's things we can do alongside this program. I think on the ground, we're really interested in different models of R&D that can help, particularly micro SMEs, with that. So whether that's new ways of working, whether it's pooled workforce, whether it's helping people to somehow able to maintain a longer R&D kind of time frame than you can if you're trying to pay the bills. You know, the diversion most SMEs have into paid work, and the R&D stops because, you know, you've got to keep yourself running. So I think we're really interested in solutions that people might come up with to how you do that. But we will keep on the definitional point.
That's great. It's a fundamental to the engagement of any micro business that they can
Yeah.
get a tax credit back.
Yes. No. So there's a longer piece on tax credits as well. I think. So I think that's a particular thing that we'll look to change. Let's on that. So all right. So Anthony wants to.
Sorry. So Anthony Lilly, you'll see me in a minute. Two answers to that question, which is really crucial. One is, to some extent, the existence of this programme is a reflective of the fact that we've managed to fudge it enough to make it true for a bit, that there is R&D in the creative industries, because that's what this is about. And we know there is. You know, when I used to chair the digital content forum, we got people claiming R&D tax credits. Two is, this is to some extent an experimental programme to then explain why it needs to change structurally. So there's the politics of it, which we've got further with by getting this funding than we ever had before. And then the job, in a way, the job of this programme, long-term strategic policy-wise, is to explain to those people who don't get it, and also for us to develop actual models that are true, as Drew just said. So there's a sort of twin track to it, but it's a really crucial question.
Cool. Well, let's start at the front and we'll work our way backwards.
Thank you very much. Stephen Waters, that creative thingy, what's it, CRC? You noted in your presentation that there are already well-established lines of communication between the institutions of higher education, particularly when it comes to research projects. We, as an independent business, wouldn't necessarily know how to go about tapping into those lines of communications. Is there some facility where people aren't aware of how to do that, might get some help?
So I think what I would say is those lines of communication between the research community and industry is very strong in some places and some sectors. I think what we're looking for is bids that have that and can demonstrate that they have that connectivity with businesses. I think if the question is, are we going to network businesses with the bids as they emerge, I think that's, if we feel that if there is a need to do that, I think we're open to doing that as they emerge. But it'll be easier once we know who's actually bidding to then communicate out to a wider community and say, if you're interested in this, we understand that, you know, there's a partnership coming together with these preoccupations in these in this geography or in this sector. Okay.
Thanks. I'm Darren Koska from the University of Bath, and I currently run CAMERA, which is a digital economy research centre, which is about £5 million investment. So we're definitely kind of STEM, but we work with creative industries. So we are STEAM, actually, I would say. So my question about this programme is, so you're talking about R&D, and I've heard STEAM this morning, but I haven't heard mention maths, physics, engineering. I haven't these kind of terms being used. So how kind of my kind of concern slightly with these kind of with these clusters potentially is that it's going to be kind of 70% the arts, and then which is fine. But kind of how serious are you about having the as an engineering, as we come in as engineers, how serious are you about having that? How much do you want to see that maths, engineering, physics side of the R&D in there? So I mean that's kind of.
So it's an interesting one. So this is the top down or bottom up design question. So we're open to all of that, but we're not going to impose it from the top. So I think this is the important point about the project here, is to identify as a series of research addressable challenges. So identify the challenges and then gather together the research assets that can address them. So if that's in particular parts of the creative industries, so screen-based media, games, the emerging area of VR, we would expect a lot of the solutions to that to include STEM partners, and I think everybody here, actually, the Southwest is, Southwest England is very strong in this area, so you would expect that to be a fundamental strength of the cluster is the research assets in that area. But that's got to come from you guys. It's not got to come from us. If we said it's got to be 30% arts and humanities, 30% human-computer interaction and psychology, and whatever that is left, 40% creative, that would be bonkers. So it's got to come from what you articulate. Is there's a cluster here, a cluster of businesses that have these preoccupations and problems, and we can address them through R&D, and we need these assets. And hey presto, we've also got these assets to do it.
Okay, yeah.
If we go that way, Darren.
Hi, Pauline Burt from Film Cymru Wales. We have a pan-Wales responsibility around R&D for film. I'm just interested in the broader context as this challenge fund obviously came out from the industrial strategy, or was a response to that, which is UK-wide. And we've obviously got a more focused programme here that's then looking at tighter clusters and perhaps cities in many instances. I'm interested to know what the appetite is to develop perhaps scalable and transferable solutions out of these different clusters that might go beyond those clusters and have a broader impact.
So I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think in a way, one of the things that we heard this morning from Dick's presentation and then Ian and Sara is that in some ways that's what happened in Create, was that some elements of a model were transferred and built upon and bespoke into a new solution with the particular context of Cardiff. I may have got that wrong. So I think those are good outcomes. I think they're not objectives, if I can say that. I think they will be very good outcomes. I think within that wider cluster conversation that Baz has kicked off, they would be seen to be very useful outcomes, and that's perhaps where the pilot thing makes some kind of sense. But I don't think that on their own they would be objectives, if that makes sense. It's good, we're getting big, this is great, we're getting big conceptual questions here, not detailed technical ones.
Very happy by it.
So, let's
Thank you. Martin Boddy from the University of the West of England. A very quick comment and then the question. My comment about R&D is that R&D makes it sound like it's rather old-fashioned linear relationships between universities moving into industry and providing the solutions. And I think we probably all know that's not the case, not just with SMEs, but with bigger companies as well. It's a sort of circular, collaborative, ongoing process which takes some time, which leads me to the question, which is those of us who've had BEIS funding or EU funding for economic growth-related projects, we tend to work to fairly well-specified targets for economic growth in terms of jobs and GVA, new products, etc., etc. And there's a time frame attached to those usually. For example, we've got a university enterprise zone at the moment funded by BEIS and the LEP. Is that something that you'll be expecting, because this is BEIS money, as was stressed earlier, in bids? Will you be looking for KPIs which actually demonstrate attainment or contribution to economic growth, or is it more that you're looking for types of initiatives and interactions which have the potential to, but wouldn't necessarily evidence economic growth?
Bit of both, really, I think.
I mean, so I'll kind of give my perspective, and then Dylan can tell us what's actually the case. So I think the team and the leadership at AHRC have done a rather brilliant job of getting this programme underway without the straitjacket of ERDF type. We've all been involved in those projects where after 18 months you're trying to work out how many jobs you've really protected or created, and then trying to work out how you could possibly fill in that form. So I don't think we're at that stage. So we're looking for propositions, aren't we?
Yeah, so there's going to be when we put the business case for this together and had it approved and signed off, and we've put together our delivery plan, there is a big section in that in terms of things like benefits realisation, evaluation, evidence, and all the things that we're going to need to provide in the back end. But we do recognise that that's one of the things, that's the responsibility is on us to do that. on behalf of the programme, but we will need to work with the people who are funded to be able to pull that information together in a way which is digestible and understandable and actually proves that the programme is doing what we've said it's going to do. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to try and build a kind of framework for that, and then we're going to work with the funded partners to try and work out whether, in a sort of well, you can use the word co-design, sort of co-design process really, to find something that works well for you, but also works for us to deliver the information that we need to do. So we are actually putting some dedicated resource into this programme specifically on that exact issue. So whereas I know previous AHRC initiatives, we may get in touch with you towards the end of the programme and say, can you give us loads of evidence right now? We're absolutely not going to do that with this programme. It's going to be far better thought through with the way we're actually going to manage that. But yeah, it will be in a kind of collaborative process with the people that we're funding.
Did you note the laugh you got out of that one? That line? It's a very distinctive kind of laugh.
Yeah. From certain individuals. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's get to the end of the row, and then we'll come back, and then we'll start to work our way backwards.
I'm afraid this isn't... hello, yeah. I'm Olwen Mosley. I am the Dean of Cardiff School of Art and Design. I just noticed, and I've just checked up, so this is a bit of a boring, nerdy question in some ways. When you mentioned the subsectors, you didn't mention, and it may just be, there was a slide missing or whatever, but one of the subsectors around design, animation, creative tech, it was kind of not there. And I've been I'm a designer, so I've been listening out for the word design. And advertising and marketing is the other part of it.
Yeah, I just thought I didn't want to go through 18 slides.
No, it was a grouping. Okay,
yeah,
that's all right, as long as it's not...
The design one is very interesting, and if you're interested, and when we release the data, I'd be really, really interested to see what you make of it.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the problem, in a way, the subsectors sounds like great, but the subsectors themselves are diverse and problematic. And
artificial in some way.
Yeah, and I think one knows that eventually what we'd like to go down to is some kind of sectors that make sense to the sectors themselves.
Sure,
but
yeah. I was just checking.
Yeah, no, it'll be that, and design is central, as we know.
To everything.
Yeah, particularly to getting people to talk to each other.
We can scrap everything else and just keep that.
Nice try. Okay. Sorry, we're still going straight on that row. Is the mic still there? And then we're going up there, and then we're coming to Phil over there.
Hi.
Sorry. Hello.
Hello. My name's Hazel Edwards, and I'm also from the University of West of England. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the Arts Faculty. My question is about reflecting back on HE. I can anticipate that we may be looking at new models of PhD, master programmes, fellowships, as a result of this piece of work, and we're already looking at that with the National Productivity Investment Fund, PhDs, which are very much in partnership with our commercial partners, our cultural partners. So is that something that you have anticipated and would welcome as an outcome? And is that something that you might channel through the evidence-based centre?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I mean, one of the things on the studentship issue is that we're not actually able to directly fund those as part of this programme, just for a variety of reasons. The fact that we have to guarantee funding for the entire period, and this is, as studentships go relatively short, so we only be able to fund one cohort. But we do expect this programme to integrate well with the DTPs and the NPIF studentships that will be administered through part of the same fund. And we would expect that. And I guess part of the overall aims of the programme is to develop that pipeline and work out new ways of getting those new skills that are required in the short and long term. So I think it is going to be probably a real focus for the programme and a really kind of welcome outcome of the programme when it's done.
Just pick up one which is very slightly connected to what Dylan was saying, which is about DTPs. I think we do expect that kind of synergy. But if there was anybody considering putting in a bid which had all the same members as their DTP, don't.
Yeah.
Where should we? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go up to the gentleman in the autumnal sweater, and then we'll move along that row.
Bright orange. So I have a question about the nature of, I'm Yvon Bonenfant, Professor of Artistic Process at University of Winchester. I have a question about the nature of the existing clusters, because you're very clear that you want us to work within existing clustered environments. And I'd really like to know more about the range of, I mean, obviously you define them in the documents that you refer to, what a cluster is and how it works, but the range of possibilities for understanding what those existing clusters might be. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think it makes sense. It makes sense. I'm trying to work out what the right way of addressing that is. I mean, I think, so from that, to me, the whole idea about clusters is that it's kind of like they're all shapes and sizes, but you know them when you see them, kind of thing. So it has to have, because we're not. We see this as a kind of one-off opportunity to establish this as an area and an approach to research, investment, and so I think it was John McVeigh the other day, the chief executive of PACT, who said this to the audience in London: "This is a one-off opportunity. Don't cock it up, because otherwise we won't get further funding." So in that sense, we're focusing on where it's most likely to work and show an impact. So we need to identify clusters that have got a critical mass of business within them and have sufficient of the networking strands that interconnect them and sufficient alignment of, say, economic policy, local government, maybe, those kind of things that one can do in terms of creative enterprise zones, those kind of, so that what we're trying to do with this funding is give it the best chance of working, and then we go back and do that. So I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question. So how do you know those? Well, some of those are, big metro regions. There's an argument I know that will be put together, and I know people in Scotland are already exploring it, and I'd be surprised if people in the further southwest aren't exploring it, which is what is the nature of a cluster, a cluster with a high proportion of businesses over a dispersed geographical area. So we are open to those kind of bits. But we're not reserving a place for one of them. We're going to have work through a process that brings the best bids forward. But so there are different dynamics within clusters, and there are different identification. I think the only thing that we're saying we're not doing is we would not be persuaded by an argument that said this could become a cluster. Okay, let's work our way. So. Let's go to Phil, and then
Okay.
yeah.
Phil Parker, co-founder of Be Creative. Andrew knows, and we are a digital cluster. There's 800 freelancers, there's 70 micro companies in our network, scattered from Dundee to London down to Falmouth. And what I'm interested in is, given that we're in the digital age and people are connected digitally, so far all we're talking about is physically based clusters. And the real question I'm asking is, given that most freelancers are working on their own, they're often working from home, their bedrooms, literally, how much can we expect a sort of digital network to be part of integrating those freelancers into this program?
I think where you landed that there, Phil, at the end is really interesting. So there is a significant place-based element to this, and there's a number of reasons for that, both in terms of that where value is created. So there is a geographical element to that within the creative industries. There's kind of no doubt. How you then integrate that dispersed and freelance workforce, and the two aren't the same, I don't think. So we have some workforces that are dispersed and some that are freelance. I think is an important point. So again, we're open to how the cluster. How does the cluster work? You tell us how the cluster works, and you tell us what things you're trying to do and what components you need to make work within it. I think, having said that, I think it's probably, my guess is that's more of a component of certain sectors than it is of others. Mm-hmm. So performing arts, probably maybe not so much. Some bits of digital. We've all got friends who are very significant coders who either live in Cornwall or in the Outer Hebrides, but not as many as I would have expected 10 years ago. And where they are, it's because there are little kind of clusters and co-working spaces themselves. So I think that comes from below. It doesn't come from us. Yeah, sorry.
Amanda Ratzi from Heart of the Southwest LEP. I was just interested in your maps when you were showing clusters and hotspots. But then you also mentioned about scale up, which maybe implied that there may be an opportunity for maybe areas that weren't hotspots yet but had latent demand that could be developed as hotspots in the future. I'm just wondering what your views were on that.
First of all, I say it's great you're here, because I think we all think that the LEPs have an enormous role to play in this, in terms of, for this to work, there has to be close working with the LEPs, with their responsibilities for economic development and their strategies. So this has to be aligned with those strategies. Have a look at the data and see if it suggests more stuff like that. These are still travel to work areas, so they're still quite, they're granular, but the grains are pretty big. I think scale up is important. I think, again, for us, that the arguments would depend upon whether it's scale up because an area's got some of the components and it's a part of a wider cluster, or perhaps even a satellite of a cluster, and that's why, and it works for a particular reason, or whether the argument is one about, we want to build a creative cluster in this area because we've got this. The latter of those, I think, is less attractive for this programme than it will be for the kind of BAS-inspired sector deal programme on clusters that we all are hoping for. Sorry, down here. I'm shining a spotlight at me and I can't see anything.
There we go.
Right, we'll go the wrong way round. You can just, no, wait for the mic. And
okay. Ruth McElroy, I'm Professor of Creative Industries at the University of South Wales. One of the challenges identified is around internationalisation. And it's a different way of approaching ideas of place, of course. But it's not something that we've talked about a great deal this morning so far. So I'd just like to invite you to say a little bit more about how you're expecting to see that being addressed, or some of the issues that you've been thinking about in terms of the international aspect of this. Because you could, a mean critic might say this could start to look terribly parochial, whereas actually that's not, I think, what is driving the industry strategy.
No, so I think what we would be particularly interested in, and perhaps Anthony will come in with different perspectives on this, what we would be particularly interested in is how the activities within the cluster would achieve greater global connectivity for the businesses within it. So we would be, I think, very interested in R&D programs that intervened in supply chains, or brought businesses together. So I think the idea that clusters can connect to the world, well, maybe one of the ways they can connect to the world, SMEs, for SMEs is through larger businesses, through larger distribution networks. I think we'd be very interested in that. I think the role, and Gail, who might say something about this from Creative England, their Big Guy, Little Guy programme, I think is a really interesting one in this area, where you've got big globals working with innovative SMEs. And obviously sometimes it doesn't work, but they can pick up and distribute and amplify the innovation that they find there. So I think we're interested in that. And before I hand over to Anthony, so there's one thing I don't think we're interested in, which is the academic study of clusters across the world. And I know there are a lot of people interested in that, and it's a very, very interesting subject. But that would be more normal AHRC. Was that what you would probably have said that? Yeah, okay. All right, I got it right.
And just to mention as well, we obviously have an international co-investigator policy active at the AHRC. So if there is a need to bring in international academics or partners, we do have mechanisms to do that, but they have to be absolutely appropriate to the challenge and the cluster that the R&D programme is looking to address.
Yeah, and we'd be really interested in global businesses with a UK presence, or global businesses as collaborators, and I'm sure that we'll get bids coming forward, of which that's a kind of key part. Yeah, John.
Thanks, John Dovey from UE again. One of the challenges at the beginning in one of the slides earlier on, again echoing Ruth's question, was actually inclusion, equality, and then also skills. And certainly the former gets rinsed out of the account as you go through the narrative, which is dominated by Bayes type outcomes. And I'm really interested to get a sense of what your appetite is for spending money on inclusion, because if you want to do inclusion, which actually loads of academics and loads of universities and loads of people involved in an intelligent conversation about placemaking do want to do, because they understand that one of the threats to the creative economy is the way it produces exclusion in places rather than inclusion. And it's a big problem for us, I think, to address. If you really want to take that seriously, then you are going to have to spend money on including people who normally aren't in this room or aren't part of the conversation, and that's going to appear on people's accounts. And I just want to know what your appetite for that is.
So I think you've pressed on an ambiguity in the programme. So there's aspirations, but I think what stands the best chance of articulating that for us is solutions based in and problems based in specific circumstances. So the situation, whether it's in Bristol, whether it's in Cardiff, whether it's in Plymouth, is different. And I think we'll kind of know it when we see it. Do you know what I mean? And then it will get recognised. I don't think there's a the way we're coming at this is with all those priorities. It's not as if we're saying each cluster bid should do all of these things. You tell us which are important. We want product and service innovation to be very important for lots and lots of reasons. But how that's the issues of inclusion and how this kind of funding could impact on that successfully in Bristol, you tell us, I think is the message. Should we? All right, we'll take one last question, and then Anthony and our panellists. So gird yourself up and get ready. We've got one last question from up there.
Thank you for taking the question. Paul Kindred from the Welsh Government. It's very clear that this programme, and from the documentation you've released, that this programme is about developing products, services, innovation that has potential commercial impact, and I get that. What I haven't heard much about today is the paragraph that's front and centre in the AHRC's Royal Charter about research that focuses on cultural differences and cultural strengths in the regions and nations of the UK, and then developing from that better trained people and impacting the economy. So I was hoping to hear something about that and how this feeds into that ambition of the AHRC today, and I haven't heard much about that. So could you talk about that a little bit, please?
I think there's two elements to that. So I tend to talk, when I talk creative industries, I do mean the cultural organisations as well. And I've perhaps spent too much time talking with bays, whereas if you differentiate them, they say, well, don't do that bit. That we've just decided the cultural organisations are within our orbit, and the publicly funded cultural organisations' contribution to the wider economy is widely understood by people in this room, but not necessarily in economic departments. So things like the impact of subsidised performance company and their the absolute reliance on the commercial sector on the work that they do. So I think there's one bit of it is it's nested within it. So we articulate that. I think the other part of it is this is different for the AHRC amongst others. So this is the research councils delivering a component of an industrial strategy, rather than the research councils delivering their own remit. So it inevitably has a bit of a difference to it. I think the important thing to say there is that's because it's not money taken from the AHRC's own core funding to do this. It's it's additional funding on top. So I think, and again, well, was maybe something to pick up in the panel, is I think that the cultural component is embedded within this. And I think there's an interesting point of articulation for the idea of the creative industries, is that it includes that. So we're not ignoring it, but maybe if I'm sensing a bit, you think we've gone a bit too econometric for our own good. Yeah. And I think we're just trying to speak the language effectively.
I work in the economy department, so I'm fine with that. It's just I was trying to get a sense of whether or not cultural organisations alongside SMEs is something that you would see as a problem or something that you would see as potentially valuable.
So that you're important. That's something really, really important. So yes, absolutely. In some of the sectors that we're talking about in the creative industries, the that perhaps the most important thing we can do is articulate large organisations with research. In some of those sectors, those large organisations are our various national museums, galleries, archives and libraries. So we've got, I know we've got the Science Museum in the room, who are not often thought of as a Southwest organisation, because they're obviously in Kensington, but they own an airfield just up the road where they're going to move hundreds of thousands of objects. You know, so I think those kind of, taking the opportunity to involve those kind of players is absolutely essential to this.
And I think we've been really clear about the fact that we're open to including independent research organisations, of which lots of these large cultural institutions are. So we're absolutely not counting them out of the programme. It's just that their inclusion in it needs to be justified in lines with what their R&D partnership is actually trying to achieve. So if it's clear what that aspect is, then that's absolutely not out of scope. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. I'm handing over to you slightly later, but they were. Thank you. That was a great set of questions by comparison with what we had in London yesterday.
Well done, Bristol.
Right. I'm Anthony Lilly. I've chipped in a couple of times this morning. In this context, I'm chair of the programme. I'm an AHRC council member and a professor of creative industries at the University of Ulster, but actually, as quite a few people in the room will know, because I've been here a lot of times over the years, I'm actually a producer in the creative industries, working across digital, telly, games, live events and theatre and all sorts of things, most of the time. With this particular hat on, I joined the AHRC Council about 3 or 4 years ago, and I was sort of came in at the end of the hubs process, and I was up and down here to see various things at React. Last time I stood at this podium, I was commissioning artwork. I briefly was the chief exec of the Space, the joint venture between the Arts Council and the BBC. I did the repositioning, is the polite term, for the Space, and commissioned the Laura Kriefman from Pervasive Media Studios' amazing mass crane dance on the front here. So I live in between, essentially, in liminal spaces, as I've learned to call it now. I'm a bit of an academic, between creative industries, technology, policy, and the arts, actually. And I'm going to give you a little gloss on the answer Andrew just gave about cultural institutions. I used to run one of them for a while. I was a trustee of the ENO, and then I was part of the team that ran it. I would say, in answer to that question, look at the supply chain that the cultural institution has around it. Look at the network of companies and creatives that it works with. Don't look at its resilience and its bottom line as being a commercial outcome, because it's not. It's in the minds of economic departments, it's a reduced subsidy outcome. But if you can create businesses and help create businesses that are in that supply chain, both Andrew and I have run digital media companies, and we've both made quite a lot of money out of the BBC over the years. That's a supply chain. A lot of people in this room will have done the same by working on innovative projects which you've then worked on internationally, or where you've held intellectual property rights, etc. So don't think of the cultural institution and this as being a kind of quasi-subsidy situation. Do think of it as a player in those clusters and in those economic structures. Before I go to the panel, I'll just give you kind of what the process of getting this money has been like, sort of summary. So I was involved in it from the top. About 18 months ago, in fact nearly 2 years ago, we started thinking about how the AHRC should follow up the investment in the hubs, of which of course React was one. And we looked very carefully at what had gone well about those, but also at the lessons that were coming out of them in terms of what could be scaled. And for instance, React was very much about the importance of place and spaces and secondary and kind of independent spaces for collaboration, the role of creative producers, the role of investment and finance in building on what had been learned in those hubs. And Andrew Thompson said this morning, I think the hubs were, to some extent, in one way, they were an exercise in learning about how to operate in this space, learning how to operate around creative industries in the way that partnerships are put together and how a research council can intervene. We started working on the idea of challenge-based investments for our next wave of creative industries policy before the government had even thought they were going to have an industrial strategy, because we felt that was the right direction of travel for the AHRC. So we would have been spending an 8-figure number regardless from core AHRC money in this way. It wouldn't have been at this scale. It certainly wouldn't have been at this speed in terms of the need to turn around bids in this way. I think all those are rather good things, that people are having to move quickly. And just in teeing up the conversation about partnerships, I'm currently as chair of this thing and essentially acting as Andrew Thompson's deputy on creative industries. I'm doing a lot of meetings with two people who call themselves VCs. Quite a lot of people in this room know one set of those people better than the others, the Vice Chancellors. And a lot of the conversations have started from a kind of, this isn't research money. This isn't what we're used to. You're not asking us to do what we normally do. And we're not entirely comfortable with that. We can see why you were doing it, but it's quite uncomfortable making. And I quite like uncomfortable. It means you have to get up and move around. And at the other end, the other people called VC, venture capitalists, that I've been meeting have been saying, but this isn't really what we need, because this doesn't make products that we can invest in straight away. This doesn't immediately make it possible for us to scale and grow companies. And it comes to the point that was made earlier about what R&D is in this sector. I sort of feel if neither end is terribly comfortable, if neither kind of VC is comfortable, we might have pitched it somewhere interesting. We might have pitched it in a kind of liminal space. But what keeps me awake, nothing much keeps me awake actually, but what sort of keeps me awake at night is the thought that in 6 years' time, I don't particularly want to end up in front of the National Audit Office explaining how we had a lovely time, but we didn't deliver any of those growth targets. We didn't deliver any new companies. There weren't innovations in products, services and experiences. And I would take you back to that phrase. That is the lens through which I see this funding. It's not everything. But if you can't see an innovation in IP, a challenge in IP, through the lens of product, services and experiences, I think it's not framed right yet. If you can't see the importance of diversity, we just had a question, in the way that it drives, in the way that the use of a creative case for diversity and really embedding that in the way you think about your challenge and your cluster, if you can't see it, not in the market, but if you cannot see it as being something that can give a credible trajectory to product, service and experience innovation, I don't think it's for this programme. If we're abstractly studying, the challenge is, what is the role of IP in the creative economy? That's an Ian question in his previous life. It's probably not fundable here. It's a permanent question in my commercial life, by the way, because I'm currently negotiating with rights lawyers in New York about a big show in London. And I really wish they were interested in innovation, in IP. They're mostly interested in just getting paid large sums of money. But if it's an abstract question you're asking, you need to operationalise it into something that could have benefits in product, service and innovation. So what I'm going to do as I walk across the stage before we go to the panel is I'm going to ask you to run a video, because I think we're going to see a video of some innovative, or a particular innovative piece of work in the VR immersive sort of space. So if you run the MPEG, please. Always start a panel on a trombone. John, that was a piece of your work, wasn't it? I'll just go down the panel. So at the far end, John Durrant, Creative Director of BDH, Matt Wordley, Chief Operating Officer of Orchard, and then Professor Jen Stein, who's based here at Watershed as Professor of Design Futures at UWE, and old colleague and friend of mine, Gail Craig, who is the Head of Policy at Creative England. So, and come back, my mic's on, great. John, that was a bit of your work. So I worked in virtual reality, augmented reality at PlayStation with J.K. Rowling a little while ago. Every bit of it was R&D. How was that?
It was actually. I mean, it was a celebration of Magritte's life, obviously. He died 50 years ago this year. It was 50 people experiencing a 10-minute ride through Magritte paintings. We had 3,000 paintings to choose from. We choose 40 in the end. It was an incredible challenge because basically the artwork's flat, and the illusion of Magritte, he talks about 3D space and illusions and gags and things like that, but basically what you're having to work with is flat. So we had to cut it out and create a kind of worlds for it. What was great about Magritte is actually, which we didn't realise before we took on the project, was what a great landscape painter he was. An amazing sort of spaces he created in these paintings. And once you start to delve into them, you realise he was a graphic designer. He learnt, he went to college and learned to design wallpaper, a bit like Andy Warhol. Similarly, he was a graphic designer.
Okay.
So it's just interesting that sort of people coming out of college that now, you know, in terms of being called an artist, Magritte was a great player, wasn't he? His paintings are worth 30 million quid each. I mean,
Yeah.
You know, amazing.
So I've always found, looking back on projects which have turned out to be R&D and successful, there's usually a moment where you think it's all going to fail because you don't know how to do a thing. Was there one of those? Were there lots of those?
Absolutely. Basically, you're dealing with phones that don't have a battery life. They're going to run out, they're going to overheat. And when you're in a bowler hat on a beach and you're playing to 50 people, basically everything heats up. So we had to have a chiller cabinet with 50 phones in and 50 phones inside headsets, and basically we had to swap them over every 2 hours. So we had 40,000 people through it in 3 months.
And were there particular challenges in the making of the work, or were there things that have come out of having made it that you now think are interesting and difficult challenges for the next thing?
For everyone here, the challenge is going to be story. Okay, you've got a story about the history of somebody's life through their work. Where's the story? How are you going to build it to make it a compelling 10-minute visceral experience? And so that's the thing, you've got to connect people, you're going to make compelling services or products or whatever they are, but they have to tell you a story, and they have to, basically, you feel part of it, feel you want to see it.
So obviously I don't believe this, but isn't that just making stuff up? I mean, is that proper R&D?
I think it's basically comedy, animation, timing, music, conducting, all sorts of different disciplines, and understanding you have no fear of the technology. The technology is just there for tools.
Yeah.
You've got brilliant people, you can create brilliant teams, imagine stuff.
So what's the difference between that research? So you've researched into what the material might be. You've got development in the sense of sort of traditional television or creative industries development of working the idea up. What's the difference between those things and actual R&D as it's defined? You know, are there particular places where the technology intersects with the storytelling, where new things can be possible?
Basically, we're working with really, really good people. They're just developing R&D all the time. And the best thing to do, the best creative agencies in the world, don't repeat themselves. Yeah. So you're constantly R&D, you're constantly trying to do better than the next person, constantly trying to reinvent what you did last time. Just don't repeat yourself.
Matt,
which is really challenging, because basically you do a product like this and somebody goes, oh, I love that Magritte VR. Can we have one?
Yeah.
You know, and actually you go, well, yes, but if you're coming to us, we're going to deliver something different.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody once asked me, when am I most innovative? And I said, when I'm most irritated by something. And it's sort of that version. Matt, did that ring true for you?
It did. I actually have a bet to win. I wouldn't sit on stage and wear a HoloLens. So to win that bet, I now have HoloLens on. So Sarah, if you want to take the picture, I've done it. Absolutely, it resounds.
Is it on though?
It's not on. You wouldn't want to see what.
So it's basically the world's most expensive inert hat at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. If you haven't played one of these, they're fascinating
good.
From an R&D perspective. Kind of our company's fortunate the size where we were able to go out and purchase a couple of these purely from an R&D perspective, just to play. And at the moment there's a fight in our office about who gets to take them home at night, whether how much it will game playing or whether it's actually R&D to be discussed. But ultimately, unless we got access to this technology, we wouldn't be able to see some of the things that are coming down the line in the future.
So there's a couple of things in there, there's lots of things in there, but there's a thing in there about access to technology, there's a thing in there about skills, you're sort of saying people need to know about what this is, what it's possible, develop the sort of capabilities.
Absolutely. So, we're quite fortunate at Orchard. We're a team of over 50, and there's three main strands to the business. One, which is a sort of a traditional full-service agency, but we have sort of writers and producers and directors and technicians and production managers. and it's entwined with two other strands, that being we're the largest independent music promoter in Wales. And the third strand is we make TV programmes. Now, they're all disparate businesses, but in effect, part of the Orchard's success has been the fact that in effect we created our own cluster. And that's how we actually achieved growth to get to that stage. Within Wales, actually, Wales has historically had an issue that companies get stuck at that sort of 1.5 million turnover, 10, 15 people. And we did that through creating a cluster of different skills. So we have our events team, our exhibitions team, our production team, and for us, you know, that's been the driver.
And do they need to work together? Academics are fond of the term interdisciplinary, and Andrew said I would say anti-disciplinary at some point, so there's your bet, you've won that one. When I used to head a 50-person agency called Magellan, and it's still around, but doesn't really operate at that scale anymore. We never thought about disciplines and structures in that way. We always thought about things we were trying to do, problems we were trying to solve, people we wanted to work with. And it turned out we were being anti-disciplinary in the sense that, you know, we didn't build a wall that said these people must not talk to those people because they are different. The only time we ever did that was when mostly the development team insisted on going in a quiet room away from all the people who were coming up with stories and doing sales because of practical things like it was just too bloody noisy. Yeah. But there was never a sort of disciplinary model. How do you get them to work together inside your outfit?
I think it's ultimately, obviously, it starts with a client's strategic need for a solution for something. And in
do you ever suggest what the client should buy?
I think it depends on the project, but more often than not, you go back to the very root cause of what the client is trying to achieve before you start looking at what they might buy or fully understand the issue. In fact, it's been for us the projects actually that we like working on, we love working on the most, are the ones where we do get virtually all the departments working together, because that's actually where you see the magic and the creativity and the things happening, where you're bringing the technicians together with the coders, with the creators, with the writers, with the production managers, with the logistics people, with all of those type of things, and that's really ultimately where the really nice stuff happens.
Brilliant. So Jen, that's a good cue for you really in lots of ways for me. So your work's, I suspect, always been multi or anti-disciplinary. Certainly that's what I always think of coming out of, you were at Southern Cal for a while, weren't you?
Yep.
That sort of way of thinking. Is that model a requirement of success in a cluster like we're trying to put together? I mean, if I'm not...
Yes.
Put your hand in the air if you're not from UE, by the way. Is that yes it is, and if so, what are the criteria or the conditions for success of that?
So in my time in Southern California, before coming here, which I'm trying to do here now as well, I ran a lab that was an R&D lab within a cinema school. So we were a human-computer interaction lab, thinking about both storytelling and new forms of storytelling, but also about telling stories about emerging technologies.
Okay.
So I'll explain that. We'd worked with some big industry partners. They'd come to us often with a 5 to 10 year out problem, so Horizon 3. And we'd put together a team that we'd need to create that experience.
Could you share what sort of problem they would describe? I mean, there are examples?
Sure. So for a while we worked with BMW and Mini. At the time we didn't realize it, but we were actually talking about the future of autonomous vehicles and the things we might do in cars when we don't have to focus on driving. Los Angeles, car culture.
Yeah.
But we were thinking about interaction design in cars. So we thought about sensors and big data, and we created a soundscape for a car so you'd better understand what was happening in the world around you outside of that car. So we put together engineers and writers and sound designers, and we drove around LA, and we each played a sort of a part of a musical soundscape for a while based on what sensor was being triggered.
Okay.
But it took a team of a creative team and a technical team, and we had to bring those together to think about. It turns out that some of the stuff we did back in 2011 is going into 2018 minis.
Right.
So it was sort of about both telling the story about what this kind of the creative industries being put into the automotive world might be, but also telling stories about the implications or the possibilities of that. So both sort of trying to create a conversation about possibilities and maybe about pitfalls, but bringing together an anti-disciplinary team to figure out what teams are needed. And at a university, we're able to do that. I know Andrew mentioned agile development, which we don't like to use a lot, but we could do it there. We could do blue sky research really quickly, really rapidly, and it also gave our students the opportunity to think about like what skills they'll need going forward, what skills the industry might need for their teams, the role of creative producers and bringing all of these people together and speaking a language about these different kinds of roles that are needed. So anti-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, yes.
Yes, yes, yeah. I'm an old sort of theatre lovey before I got into digital, and it strikes me that there's quite a lot of this stuff we already know in quite a lot of more established media. You've just described precisely how you make a play.
Yeah.
You have designers and you have lighting designers and sound designers and stage managers and props people, all those people in the same room with the people who are the people the public see, and you have the architects of those experiences, the directors, and you need somebody to put them in the room and somebody to make sure there's water in the room and all those other things. They are kind of fairly traditional. In a way, they're quite traditional models, but is there an argument that they've been lost a bit in the creative industries, in the more industrialised sectors of creative industries, like television, where, for instance, where it's a little bit more linear and you make this and there's a process, it's less sort of R&D and early stage? Don't know, maybe?
Well, I mean, television has changed so much just in the past 5 years from a sort of Netflix and Hulu kind of perspective. The kinds of television we're watching, the format of television, the time format, the kinds of stories. This sort of comes back to inclusion and diversity too. What kinds of stories do we tell going forward? Yeah. There's been one perspective for thousands of years on storytelling, but what are the new kinds of challenges we face with that as well? So I think that there are bigger challenges beyond the 30-minute to an hour format or how we're going to view these things, and that's also what we need to focus on.
Great. So the two of you from companies, Jen's on the panel. I'm coming to Gail in a second about the structure of this. But so what sort of questions might you collaborate with that, bring that approach to in your daily lives? And how might you need supporting? Because as Andrew Chitty said earlier, I've run companies, still run companies. You've got to keep everybody fed, watered, roof over their heads in the company. Everybody's got a mortgage or not, those things. What kind of support and what kind of questions, and then what would make it possible? I'm going to go John first.
Money.
Money.
That's right.
As
creative
Bjorn
people,
and Benny once said.
Like Netflix have done, they choose very, very creative people. You're good at what you do. Here's £3 million. Make me a series, or 10. Or we make Our Planet, which is a follow-up to Blue Planet and Planet Earth, which was actually made by the same production team as Planet Earth, is being made in Bristol. And basically, they've been commissioned by Netflix to save the world. By 2020, they're going to tell us all how to save the world. 30 million quid. That's how you make change. So, high ambition, nice bit of dosh, finding the really, really creative people and going, show us.
So what's the job of a scheme like this, a programme like this, then, in that context? Is it, lead the witness, is it to do with setting up the structure so that we can carry on doing that over a long period as a country? Is it skills? I mean, what's coming out? If we get this right, what will be coming out into companies like yours in 5 to 10 years?
I'd relax. I basically just think, don't think about what the end game is totally. Just relax, enjoy the ride. You're with good people because you've chosen them, you've talked to them. It's going to be a pleasure, and people are going to love the stuff that you're going to make because it's going to be compelling, and people will want to give you cash ultimately. Because a lot of these projects, I'm assuming, you're going to charge people 15 euros for, or whatever, or subscribe to.
Does that work for you, Matt, as well?
I think, ultimately running a commercial entity, we have 54 team members that we have to pay and look after on a monthly basis. So ultimately the financial side of it is key. I think we claimed our second year's worth of R&D tax credits. That's great. That allows me to justify to the board the fact that we are able to invest in new technology, give the guys and girls time to look at new products, look at what's coming down the line, look at ways to innovate. I think there's huge opportunities to help business understand the R&D that's within their business, and we found a specialist company to work with who can work with us at this current time. But I think the fact that we got to a 10 million plus turnover organisation without doing a tax, only doing our second year of R&D tax credits, even though throughout, when I look back at the history, there's a huge amount that happened. We should have been doing it for years. I think the other area as well is the opportunities here to help companies really understand when they are creating IP in their business and how to capitalise that, particularly working closely with universities. We have discussions with Cardiff University, and interestingly enough, I was actually at Swansea University yesterday, and we'd had a team of their engineering departments into us, and they were like, wow, you guys do so much, there's so much we can see as opportunities. We went across to them, and our reaction was exactly the same. The fact, again, that we've got such a large size without having those discussions is telling that those links aren't there between the education and the society. And obviously I know with Sara in Cardiff, she's doing a great job of helping forge those links.
Right. So can I'm going to take this to Gail in terms of structure and Creative England's response. I'm hearing, I might be hearing something wrong, I'm hearing a sort of implicit notion about how you take risks. The kind of R in R&D has always felt to me like it's also about risk, and whether you kind of harness it and see it as an opportunity. I'm one of the people who takes risk. I don't spend all my time mitigating them, but most public funding systems worry most about mitigating, not taking. Are there lots of risk-taking companies, that you see in your Creative England work, and because I know you invest in them through Creative England, are there lots of risk-taking companies who are sort of desperate for the opportunity we're providing? And if so, how do we hook them up with universities?
Yes, I think that, so Creative England has a track record in investing in, so we've invested in and supported about 670 creative industry businesses, all outside of London. So we're incredibly interested in, as a kind of policy issue, access to finance and enabling those companies to access the investment they need to grow. And a lot of the companies that we invest in may be kind of service companies, and we give them the capital to actually spend time on R&D so that they can develop new products and services which they can then monetize and commercialize and kind of pivot their business model. And our funding enables them to do that. I kind of think that there is a huge issue for creative industry businesses generally in terms of their ability to access finance, and that there is a disconnect between the investment community and creative industry businesses and their business model, partly in a large part because of their basis in intellectual property. It's an intangible asset, and because of a kind of lack of track record of data within the investment community, so your kind of mainstream lenders don't see the performance data of creative industry businesses, so they don't see it as a kind of safe bet, so they'll put their money somewhere else. And so R&D and innovation is underserved because of that lack of investment, and that's something we seek to address.
And Andrew talked about your big guy, little guy program, the sort of way in which supply chains can be valuable in that. Certainly, I mean, we, back in a decade ago, 15 years ago, Magic Lantern, we explicitly went for clients who would help us fund things that we didn't know how to do yet in the supply chain. I mean, what was big guy, little guy? How does it work, and can we learn from it for this program?
Absolutely. So I think one of the huge issues for the creative industries is, as lots of people have talked about today, the nature of it as an industrial sector. So it's dominated by SMEs, but micro businesses, and a huge freelance workforce. Now that's incredibly valuable in terms of being nimble, being able to kind of a very flexible workforce that has huge benefits. But if you're talking to an industrial sector, that has huge disadvantages. So, kind of from a creative industry's perspective and talking to BAYS, if BAYS want to talk to some economic sectors, they can get 4 people in a room and basically cover it. For the creative industries, it's the exact opposite of that. So those supply chains are also much harder to navigate and bring together. And Creative England has done work bringing micro businesses together with also there's a missing middle in the creative industry. So there aren't that many kind of medium-sized enterprises. There are some huge ones, and there are lots of very innovative, dynamic ones. And bringing the two together is a real challenge. And bringing the two together in a way that works for both partners. So big companies are very interested in, obviously, for very clear reasons, in accessing innovative talent, people who are very nimble in their thinking and very innovative in their approach, which you can lose in something like Microsoft. And the small companies very obviously are very interested in accessing, the kind of the platforms, the expertise within those huge companies. But if you're Microsoft, how do you find a small number of games developers? How do you curate that? How do you kind of bring them together? That's a huge challenge that they could address, but their systems aren't set up to do that. So Creative England has worked to to kind of bring that pool of businesses together for people like Microsoft, for Sky, for Disney. But at the same time, if you're a micro business, how do you protect your rights? How do you ensure that deal works for you? Accenture did a report a few years ago about these big guy, little guy partnerships, and the big guy said, oh, they're fantastic, they're really great. The little guy said, actually, we thought we got a bit ripped off there and we're not very happy about it. And Creative England is kind of an honest broker in bringing those two together. So they have huge value for the industry, but they have to be done in the right way.
That rings true. A lot of people nodding at that point. I certainly remember having partnership done to me a lot at Magic Lantern over the years. I'm going to come to the room in a moment, but I'm going to go back to Jen before I do. So ready if you have a question. So back to kind of the how of this, the kind of how do you make these innovative R&D projects work, regardless of what the challenge is. And this is one of those, the only chair of a panel will ever ask me this. Some golden rules for sort of making anti-interdisciplinary projects work from your experience?
I think it was mentioned during one of the presentations about starting the conversation, not just the sort of the academy defining the problem, but starting the conversation. I think that conversation needs to be a continual and iterative conversation in this as well. So with small businesses and with, I really love the lab model, an R&D lab model where people are in a space together having those conversations continually, having design briefs, pushing each other through that development process, but always having a conversation ongoing and having that sort of sharing a vision. It might not be a shared vision, but just sort of having a presence in a conversation about what comes next, what comes in 18 months from now, what comes in 5 years from now, but having that anti-disciplinary conversation between sort of academics and businesses and the creatives at large, and technologists and creative technologists and all parties involved, because we can't develop in silos. It all has to come together and be part of a conversation together.
What do you think about the sort of focus on seeing this through the lens of product, service, experience, sort of innovation? It would be quite easy to have a really interesting and long conversation about the process of innovation, and lots of people do that. But sort of our assumption, and I have to take the blame for some of this in terms of the discussions a year and a half ago, was that we just wouldn't get industry people engaged. I was barely engaged and I was sitting on the council. We wouldn't get people like us engaged in the abstract nature of how to innovate and how to collaborate. We would, if we could put it in the context of something realistic, because you're doing it all day. John's just said you're probably in a different tier of risk or in a different tier of research difficulty, but you're doing it all day. Is that fair from your experience of your work and from how you commercial guys might engage with something like this? Is that a fair assumption?
I think so, yeah. It's basically,
and then questions if you have any.
It's about, just making it part of your working practice, really, and just making sure that, because you're trying to do better than you did before, and you did something different than you did before, you're taking a risk, but creative risks with creative people with a good, solid way in which you can create discussion. So the Pervasive Media Studio here is a fantastic conversation all day, every day, and it creates lots and lots and lots of ideas, and that's the perfect model, say, for ideas.
Great, okay. There you go, lights up. Looks like Dick. It's Dick.
Can I do a bit of leading the witness again?
Yeah.
So John, it's great, everything you said, on the front foot as ever. I think what you either didn't want to talk about, or are perhaps not as conscious as you might be, is that what you did with Magritte and what you did before Magritte was massively innovative, not necessarily in what you made, although it was, but in the business model that you used to recoup your cash investment. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was interesting. We got this Bosch commission because of we did a virtual reality ride through the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Last year was 500 years since his death, and we took it upon ourselves to basically create a kind of virtual world of his painting. But it's a triptych. I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but it's Eden, which is you get to meet Jesus, introducing Eve to Adam. And then in the middle, there's a party, a bit like Glastonbury, lots of naked people eating fruit and having sex. And then the last panel is hell. So you descend down into the depths of hell, and you get your last rites read to you by a pig dressed as a nun.
Also sounds like Glastonbury.
Yep. And basically we decided to publish this app and then charge for hell. Just to see how much people loved Bosch, but also how much they were intrigued enough to part with a £5 to finish it off. And it's those sorts of models which, we just punted out there, put out there, and just to see, and being able to publish on Android, Google Play, and iTunes was, was a real liberation. You get a fantastic feedback from the fans and the people who like the work, and that also feeds into how you're going to do the next thing.
Great. Okay, over here, please. Time for a couple more.
Yeah, John made a really good point earlier about money. If your lovely HEI wants to engage with a set of very small micro businesses,
Mhm.
are they able to, is money allowed to change hands in that, or is it expected to be done in a kind of, this is a benefit to us, so we'll engage with it?
Both of the above. So
So
real money
money
is
can
able to
change
change
hands.
hands,
Yeah.
but there will need to be a sort of contribution over and above, like a kind of Innovate or that sort of model where there is a cash component and the company's bringing something. So that's a version of, you can't make profit out of this money, but there is cash that can change hands.
Yeah.
It's in the call itself. I'm looking for Dylan. It can be up to 30% can be spent with SMEs.
Cool, that's going to be a really important
Which
thing, so
I
that's
have to say,
great.
yeah, we should probably say that is not terribly usual in HEI funding call. What I don't want to see, and this is just me speaking personally, but I do chair the programme, is universities then building great big architectures for how to put that money into SMEs that cost a fortune, because that will result in a no. Because it's about getting it out into the projects, into the challenges as quickly as possible. One of the learnings we did have from the hubs was we can't spend a year working out how to give grants out. It's got to be hitting the ground, tyres on the road, quick.
Can I just quickly ask?
You can, of course.
That won't affect your ability to claim tax credits against the project, because there are certain things, if you receive funding in certain ways into a project, you then can't claim tax credits
It's a good and interesting question that nobody's asked yet, which we will take through to the FAQs.
Okay.
But thank you for asking it in such a public way. Anybody else before we close up? Yes, in the middle there.
Hi, Susan McMillan, Bath Spa University. We often talk about research in the abstract when we're talking about funding, but what we haven't talked about is talent development. And talent development is a really important part of this, because you wouldn't make Magritte, John, would you, without some amazing talent at
Absolutely.
BDH.
From
So
universities.
does talent development and keeping the talent in the region have a part to play in this sort of research bid environment?
So I'm going to turn it to the panel and then I'll give you my view. So I'm going to say instead of does, should talent development have a part to play in a successful bid? Gail.
I mean, from my... So, if you connect the skills coming out of universities more effectively with businesses, that is obviously a very key way to grow a cluster.
Yeah.
So if you can do that more effectively and you can ensure the interaction between universities and the businesses and the workforce that's kind of happening there, then that's only going to help that cluster grow.
I would have said that too, so that's good. Jen? Yes?
Yes.
What kind? Are there particular kinds of skills we should be majoring on? I can come back if you like.
There we are sort of in process of thinking about launching a master's in virtual reality. We have the Bristol Virtual Reality Lab. That program will sort of live within that lab.
Yeah.
And that lab is run with the two universities and Opposable VR and the Watershed and Bath Spa and
the grapevine tells me
BBC.
might be receiving even more money from sure. So that's hope on your behalf.
I think that talent, it's sort of the development of those skills. Obviously, we're all thinking a lot about immersive right now.
Yep.
But that's going to take a lot of different kinds of people, and having an anti-disciplinary program to start to think about what that means for the industry, and to have design briefs from the industry
Which are
into
Right. So those are kind of some new areas of skills. The gents at the end. So, what if we don't do this right? We fail to provide the sorts of skills you're going to need from the sector. Well, not if. What skills do you need to come out of these sorts of clusters?
Well, you lift a stone up in Bristol and there's an animator underneath. It's amazing. They're amazing. You know, they're everywhere. It's the talent is in the culture.
There are sprays you can get for that.
Talent is in the culture of the place.
Yeah.
Bristol is brimming with it. Theatre, immersive theatre, VR, performance, music. It's got everything. So, natural history, science programs. I mean, the arts programs. There's so much there, and so much. So to talk about it just being about education, I don't know, because it's like a magnet. If you're good, people come and want to get involved and come to the colleges, and it is about those. It is about the universities being part of the culture of ideas.
So that's very strong. So Matt, are there particular sort of soft skills that you need people in creative industries businesses that will come out of them learning how to work in these kind of innovative contexts?
I think if you can, I think this programme has the opportunity to ultimately, if it can create world-class companies who can deliver world-class projects, then ultimately you're going to find the world-class people will be able to develop them, or the skills or the opportunities. And it's sort of self-perpetuating if you can create and can get that momentum behind you.
Yeah.
Kind of a lot of it, I think, it's about competence and doing it and going ahead and making it happen. You know, kind of know with projects and with the things we get involved with, until you actually go out and try it, you don't know.
You don't know.
And ultimately, it's just a question of pushing the boundaries all the time.
So I'll give you my kind of AHRC answer, then I'm going to come to the panel to just ask for a top tip or two for us, those of us who are trying to run this thing, that we must do to get it right, and I've already had one. So my answer from the AHRC point of view is, when you think about a cluster, I think you have to have the history of it going in both directions. You need to be able to explain why it's a cluster and why it's got its strengths historically, how there are particular things in the now which mean you can answer the challenge, and crucially how you're going to be an even better cluster going forwards as a result of what we do. And a massive piece of that has got to be about skills and about the architecture of sort of collaboration within the cluster. So while you can't technically have PhDs funded from this programme, I think it would be logical to consider how PhDs in your MPIF or in your DTP would connect with it, how you might inflect your longer term strategy around PhDs so they closely tie up with the cluster. That would seem logical to me. Speaking as chair of this and as chair of the DTPs for the AHRC, I'd love that. We couldn't make the NPIF, if you don't know what those are, Google can tell you. We couldn't make those extra 60 PhDs we got for arts and humanities connect to the cluster. But trust me, if we had been able to, we would have tried. It was to do with timing and expectations of those things, but we would have tried to do that, and that probably tells you where the direction of travel is. And I would go right to schools as well. I think if you're not embedded, I wouldn't. It's crucial that we think about how you go through. You know, we don't need Dick to take his top off, actually full stop, we don't need that. But we don't need to do that to illustrate the STEAM point. If you are embedded with FE and with schools, and you're operating as part of the cluster more broadly, so those skills are coming through in the context of a Department for Education that seems to be at odds with large parts of the industrial strategy in terms of the EBAC, etc. If you're doing that, and you're credibly doing that, feels to me like the longer term trajectory of your cluster is more secure than if you're not doing that. So just read those as signals. I think that's pragmatic. But I also have to think it's crucially important. Creative industries, we're hearing about the growth and all the amazing potential, and we all play it out a lot. Could all stop very easily in 10 years' time if we get this bit wrong, if we get that supply of skills wrong. So there you are, happy, exciting, plus doom-laden. Top tips for me. I'm going to come along, not for me, for everybody in the room, as to how to do this one. I'm going to come along, starting at that end, if that's all right with you, John. For this programme, what must we do?
Can I go at the end?
No.
Be genuine, be open, experiment. Take a risk, because everyone benefits.
Do you think we are doing? Do you think we are last time? Do you think we are doing these things so far from what you've seen of it?
90% of what's been said, I don't understand. But the 10% I do, I'm just thinking, God, this could be really good. So I'm quite excited about that.
Actually, there's a great quote from Seamus Heaney. A guy came up to him at the end of a writer's workshop, and he's not spoken for 2 days on this weekend writer's workshop, and he said to Heaney, Professor Heaney, I must admit, I find your work makes me quite confused. And apparently Heaney said, well, confused may not necessarily be a dishonourable state.
Thank you.
Going along the panel.
I would say it's got to be talk, communicate, speak to as many people as you can from different areas. Talk some more. But ultimately, obviously, when you do put partnerships in place, and it is a bit of that big man, little man, make sure that they are good for all parties involved, and they are transparent, and they are honest, and people know what they're going to get out of it. And I think unless you have that absolute honesty and trust and mutual beneficial opportunities, then it won't work.
Sage and wise advice, Jen?
Imagine together, imagine the things we want to see and how to do those, and ask the right questions and ask the big questions now. What do we want? What will we need? And how do we make it together?
Brilliant. And Gail, what would you do if you were sitting here?
So mine is a lot more kind of pragmatic. So a cluster isn't a cluster, it's just businesses next to each other unless they're networked. So working, kind of finding, and that's not easy. That's if you're talking about micros and SMEs, finding the time and enabling those people to come together in a meaningful way when they've got a huge number of other things to worry about, like keeping their business going, like getting the next commission. So finding ways that work for micro businesses and freelancers to engage in that networking and kind of make that cluster more than a sum of its parts would be to me a huge part of this. Partnership is absolutely key. So there are huge numbers of people that have objectives aligned to deliver this. So the LEPs, local authorities, the combined authorities. Read Nesta's Geography of Creativity. I'm sure many of you have, but it is an absolute mine of information about clusters, about HEIs and their kind of performance within clusters. And read the industrial strategy, because it is different. It is about delivering against those objectives. And there's an awful lot of kind of very good stuff in there that you can use in terms of institutions bringing place and sector together, HEIs being an anchor institution in that context.
Excellent. Really helpful for me. I had a masterclass in how to think about this. Just to close then, before I hand back to Andrew, one question I expected and didn't get. Who decides? Who watches the Watchmen? One thing I should be clear on, Andrew Thompson said this morning, is it's not me, so I am insulated from any role in the decision. But it is quite important to know that the team are looking very carefully at the constitution of the peer review college, the panels that assess and review bids. And that they won't be entirely made up of traditional academic colleagues for obvious reasons. It's not that sort of program. They will have that capability, but also there will be people from industry alongside, there'll be people from policy alongside, there may well be international experts alongside. So my kind of last kind of call out to the room is, if you're one of the people who didn't respond to this meeting invitation because you thought, 80 million quid, I'll have some of that. If actually you might be a potential expert or a participant in the review process, you should let us know, because how the decisions are made is really very crucial in this side of things. Even if you're not that person, if you know of people we should know of who have expertise in this field, then we are casting the net to try and find people who can bring credible expertise, knowledge, and the ability to understand the difference between what we're describing here and a kind of business as usual Research Council funding call. We're still looking to try and ensure we've got a really good mix in that. Thank you to my panel, really helpful of you. Thank you to Gail and John and Jen and Matt. Thank you to you, and I'm handing back to Andrew.
As the person who's standing between you and lunch and some interesting conversations, all I'm going to say is thanks. That was a terrific panel. And I think raised some, very politely and very subtly, some quite serious challenges to what we're trying to do, which we need to think about, which is really helpful. Yeah. The only thing I want to say is, so the afternoon session, for those of you who are already registered and others who may now want to stay, which is technical to support those people who are already thinking about putting bids together, or at the start of putting bids together, or want to know how to put bids together, please do turn up on time, obviously. If there are some of you who haven't registered for it but now think you want to attend, that's fine too. So I think that kicks off 2:15. Let's work with that as an idea anyway. And thanks very much. Have a nice lunch.